Long before it built an empire, Assyria emerged as a small city clustered along the Tigris, shaped by its strategic geography. The earliest phases of Ashur trace to the late 3rd millennium BCE, when modest settlement clusters began to occupy a limestone terrace overlooking the Middle Tigris. Archaeological surveys indicate that these early inhabitants selected the site for its defensible topography and reliable access to the river's navigable channels. The combination of elevated ground and proximity to water created a stable foundation for long-term habitation. Pottery excavated from these layers, primarily wheel-made wares with simple geometric designs, shares typological traits with northern Mesopotamian assemblages, suggesting that the region was connected to wider cultural networks even before urban consolidation. This material evidence demonstrates that the earliest Ashur community was integrated into an emerging zone of regional exchange. The German excavations led by Walter André in the early 20th century provided the first systematic documentation of these pre-urban strata. Beneath later monumental structures, André's team uncovered mud-brick walls set on stone foundations, narrow domestic rooms, and small open courtyards. These architectural patterns indicate incremental, household-level construction rather than state-directed planning. Later reassessment of the excavation records confirms that settlement density increased gradually, with no single phase of deliberate urban redesign. This supports the interpretation that Ashur evolved organically over centuries, driven by agricultural surplus and access to trade rather than royal intervention. The evidence suggests a society transitioning from dispersed hamlets into a unified community centered on a fortified core. Religious activity appears early in the archaeological record. Excavators identified small cult installations, simple altars, offering pits, and ritual vessels, indicating that communal religious practice preceded the construction of major temples. The earliest references to the deity Ashur in later inscriptions imply continuity with these early cult traditions. Scholars argue that the city's religious identity developed alongside its political structure, creating an ideological framework that later rulers would institutionalize. This demonstrates how early belief systems contributed to social cohesion and administrative legitimacy long before Assyria became a territorial state. The site's geography shaped its early development in measurable ways. Ashur sat at a critical juncture linking Upper Mesopotamia with the Anatolian highlands. To the north, natural routes led toward key metal-producing regions. To the south, the Tigris corridor connected the community to Akkadian and Sumerian centers. Records from the late Akkadian period describe administrative movements along these routes, suggesting that Ashur served as a waypoint for officials and merchants. This placement fostered an environment in which local elites could profit from the transit of goods, reinforcing the city's orientation toward commercial specialization. The interplay between environment and economy created structural incentives that would guide Assyrian policy for centuries. Contact with the Akkadian Empire further shaped the emerging settlement. According to cuneiform sources, including administrative tablets and royal inscriptions, Akkad extended its political and military presence into northern Mesopotamia in the 24th and 23rd centuries BCE. Archaeologists have found evidence of Akkadian administrative practices, such as seal impressions bearing imperial iconography, within early layers at Ashur. These finds indicate that the settlement was integrated into Akkad's provincial system. The introduction of standardized weights, measures, and taxation procedures likely influenced local governance, encouraging the development of more formal institutional structures. This demonstrates how imperial oversight contributed to early Assyrian administrative capacity. The material record also shows increased economic activity during and after the Akkadian presence. Clay tablets referencing grain distributions, labor allocations, and livestock management point to early forms of bureaucratic coordination. While these texts are fragmentary, their formats resemble contemporary Akkadian administrative tablets, suggesting direct transmission of scribal techniques. The presence of these documents implies that local elites were already participating in regional networks of resource management. This represents a significant step toward the later emergence of Assyrian palace-centered administration. Evidence of long-distance trade becomes clearer in the following centuries. Archaeologists uncovered obsidian fragments, copper objects, and Anatolian-style ceramics within late 3rd millennium contexts. Each material points to distinct spheres of interaction: obsidian from eastern Anatolia, copper from the Taurus Mountains, and ceramics reflecting northern craft traditions. These artifacts collectively illustrate how Ashur functioned as an intermediary between resource-rich highlands and agrarian lowlands. The presence of non-local goods suggests that merchants passed through or operated within the settlement, reinforcing its role as a facilitator of transregional exchange. This commercial orientation would eventually underpin the old Assyrian trading colonies of the early 2nd millennium BCE. Interpretive studies highlight the settlement's gradual shift from village-scale autonomy toward centralized oversight. Architectural patterns from later pre-urban phases reveal thicker walls, more standardized room proportions, and evidence of coordinated construction. These changes likely reflect increasing authority among local leaders who managed labor and organized storage facilities. Archaeologists identified large communal storage jars and silo pits, suggesting collective management of agricultural surplus. This material trend aligns with the broader Mesopotamian pattern in which surplus consolidation supported emerging political hierarchies. The case of Ashur shows how early administrative organization often crystallized around economic control rather than military expansion. Despite its modest scale during this period, Ashur already exhibited traits that would define Assyria's long-term trajectory. Its reliance on the Tigris for communication and transport encouraged outward connectivity rather than isolation. Its proximity to Anatolia aligned it with metal trade, influencing later commercial policies. And its interaction with Akkadian administrative traditions fostered durable bureaucratic habits. Together, these elements formed the structural foundation upon which later rulers would construct an imperial identity. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Ashur had developed into a proto-urban community with emerging administrative institutions, established cult practices, and growing participation in regional trade. The settlement's strategic location and gradual internal consolidation positioned it to evolve into a commercial center in the coming centuries. As local elites consolidated power, the city's orientation toward northern trade transformed Ashur into a commercial hub. Under Akkad and Ur-3, Assyria learned the administrative language of empire long before it created one. The incorporation of northern Mesopotamian settlements into the Akkadian Empire in the late 24th and 23rd centuries BCE marked the first major inflection point in Assyria's political development. Contemporary inscriptions of Sargon of Akkad describe military campaigns reaching the upper Tigris, and later texts attributed to Naram-Sin confirm direct imperial involvement in the region. Archaeological evidence from Ashur, including ceilings bearing Akkadian royal names and motifs, supports the conclusion that the city was formally integrated into Akkad's administrative network. This connection introduced standardized governance practices that reshaped local authority structures and laid the groundwork for later institutional complexity. Imperial administration during this period revolved around taxation, labor mobilization, and resource extraction. Tablets discovered at Ashur and nearby sites record grain deliveries, livestock assessments, and work rotations that correspond to Akkadian economic policy. The presence of such documents indicates that northern communities were required to contribute both agricultural surplus and corvée labor to the empire. These obligations linked Assyria to a broader system of redistribution centered in the southern capitals. The impact extended beyond economic regulation. It also familiarized local elites with formal bureaucratic procedures and scribal literacy, essential features of later Assyrian statecraft. Akkadian rule introduced new forms of official oversight. Seal impressions from administrative buildings show standardized imagery, such as heroic combat scenes and divine emblems, consistent with Akkadian ideological messaging. The consistent use of these seals suggests that local administrators were closely monitored through a recognizable system of record authentication. Scholars interpret this pattern as evidence that provincial officials operated within a prescribed bureaucratic hierarchy. The diffusion of these administrative tools into Assyria marked one of the earliest stages of political centralization in the region and demonstrates how external authority influenced internal organization. The period also saw the emergence of a distinctive local governing office, the Issayake Assur, often translated as Governor of Assur. Although the title appears more prominently in later sources, its origins likely trace to the era of Akkadian domination. In this early form, the Issayake acted as an intermediary between imperial agents and local communities, overseeing tax collection and managing internal affairs. This arrangement provided a model for later Assyrian kingship, in which rulers combined ritual obligations to the god Assur with administrative responsibilities. The office of Issayake thus became a crucial institutional bridge between external imperial control and emerging local governance. Following the decline of the Akkadian Empire around 2154 BCE, the political landscape of northern Mesopotamia remained unsettled. However, Assyria soon entered another period of southern influence under the third dynasty of Ur-3. Administrative tablets from the reigns of Shulgi, Amarsin, and Shusin mention activities in the upper Tigris region, including the movement of officials and allocation of labor forces. These records demonstrate that Ur-3 rulers maintained at least indirect authority over Assur, continuing the pattern of integrating northern territories into a centralized bureaucratic state. The emphasis on standardized accounting and work organization during this period reinforced habits of record-keeping introduced under Akkad. Ur-3 administration was characterized by rigorous central planning, and its influence reached Assyria through both economic and institutional channels. Archaeologists have identified standardized weights and measures at Assur corresponding to southern norms, indicating compliance with Ur-3 regulatory frameworks. The introduction of accounting tablets written in Sumerian, the administrative language of the dynasty, expanded scribal practices in the north. This transition familiarized local scribes with dual linguistic registers, Akkadian for spoken communication and Sumerian for formal administration, a skill set that later contributed to Assyria's extensive archival culture. Evidence also suggests that Ur-3 rulers exerted influence over religious life in Assur. Although the cult of the city's principal deity, Assur, already existed, imperial texts refer to the construction and maintenance of temples across their territories. Material remains from this period show modifications to early sanctuary structures, possibly reflecting Ur-3 sponsorship or oversight. The integration of local cults into a broader religious system provided ideological coherence across the empire and reinforced the legitimacy of imperial rule. This association established precedents for the later Assyrian practice of aligning political authority with divine mandate. The continuity between Akkadian and Ur-3 administrative practices in Assyria is significant for understanding the region's later development. Both states introduced writing systems, accounting methods, and bureaucratic procedures that shaped local governance. These models persisted even after direct imperial influence waned, demonstrating the durability of institutional borrowing. Scholars identify this period as foundational for the evolution of Assyria's administrative identity, as it transformed from a loosely organized settlement into a community capable of managing complex economic and political tasks. This transition provides insight into how early state structures can outlast the empires that imposed them. The Issayake Assur continued to function under the Ur-3 system, but its role appears to have expanded. In addition to managing local affairs, the office likely coordinated the movement of resources required by the southern state. Administrative texts suggest that local leaders were responsible for maintaining communication with Ur-3 officials and ensuring compliance with imperial directives. This intersection of local leadership and external oversight created a framework in which Assyria began to exercise limited autonomy while still acknowledging higher authority. The arrangement served as a precursor to the dynastic rule that emerged in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Archaeological remains from the transition between the Akkadian and Ur-3 periods reveal increasing urban coherence at Assur. Construction projects, including improvements to fortification walls and public buildings, suggest coordinated labor mobilization. These developments reflect the influence of imperial organization on local infrastructure. Urban growth during this period indicates that exposure to large-scale administrative systems encouraged more stable political arrangements within Assyria. This interpretation is supported by the appearance of more complex residential architecture and evidence of expanding craft production. By the early 21st century BCE, the UR3 state was in decline due to economic strain and external pressures. As southern authority weakened, northern regions such as Assyria experienced reduced oversight. The institutional foundations established under Akkad and UR3, however, remained intact. Local authorities continued to use cuneiform writing, standardized accounting tools, and administrative procedures inherited from these earlier empires. As the UR3 system collapsed, Assyria shifted from dependency to autonomous political development. Freedom from southern control allowed Assyria to experiment with kingship, law, and international trade. With the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur around 2004 BCE, northern Mesopotamia entered a period of political fragmentation that opened new opportunities for regional autonomy. Ashur, no longer constrained by a southern administrative hierarchy, began to reorganize around emerging local elites who could manage the city's economic and diplomatic interests. This transition did not produce immediate territorial expansion, but it marked a clear shift from foreign oversight to internal governance. The increased authority of local rulers corresponded with renewed urban construction, expanded scribal activity, and the early development of state institutions that would later define Assyrian political identity. The Kultepe, Kanesh, tablets, thousands of cuneiform documents discovered in central Anatolia, provide the most detailed evidence for Assyria's early autonomy. Dating from roughly 1950 to 1750 BCE, these tablets document the activities of Assyrian merchants who operated trading colonies, or karam, across Anatolia. Their records reference shipments of textiles, silver, tin, and other goods moving between Ashur and the mountain passes of central Turkey. The consistency of these documents indicates that merchant families formed complex partnerships governed by contracts, interest rates, and dispute resolution mechanisms. This trade system functioned independently of any foreign empire, demonstrating that Assyria relied heavily on commercial networks to sustain its early political development. The commercial prominence of Ashur illustrates how economic activity influenced political authority. Merchant families played an essential role in civic administration by funding caravan expeditions and generating revenue for local rulers. Records indicate that tariffs, transit fees, and profit-sharing arrangements provided financial stability to the city's leadership. This linkage between economic productivity and governance fostered a political environment in which rulers depended on merchant cooperation. As a result, early Assyrian kings experimented with administrative procedures that balanced royal authority with the interests of influential households. This arrangement contributed to the formation of legal norms that were later codified in the Old Assyrian laws. The reign of Arisham I circa 1974 to 1935 BCE exemplifies the early assertion of political autonomy. Inscriptions attributed to him reference building projects, temple maintenance, and reforms that standardized commercial practices. One text records his establishment of regulations governing loan repayment and caravan security. These measures reflect a royal attempt to stabilize trade while maintaining civic order. Archaeological remains from Ashur, including early palace structures and improvements to city walls, support the notion of increasing urban organization during this period. Arisham I's policies reveal that local kings aimed to integrate the merchant sector into a coherent political framework. Administrative practices evolved alongside the development of more durable political authority. The appearance of specialized offices, such as tax assessors, caravan overseers, and storage administrators, demonstrates expanding bureaucratic functions. Seal impressions from this period show greater variation in imagery, suggesting that officials wielded distinct roles in governance. The use of standardized account tablets across both Ashur and the Anatolian colonies points to a coordinated administrative language. These practices underscore how commercial expansion encouraged the growth of record-keeping and institutional complexity within early Assyria. The rise of Shamshi-Adad I, circa 1808 to 1776 BCE, marked a turning point in the region's political trajectory. Originally from the northern town of Ekaladam, Shamshi-Adad seized control of Ashur and established a broader territorial state that extended into the Jazira and Upper Euphrates regions. His reign represents the first phase of Assyrian expansion beyond the immediate vicinity of the city. Contemporary inscriptions describe military campaigns, the construction of administrative centers, and the installation of loyal officials in subordinate towns. These steps strengthened political cohesion and demonstrated a more assertive form of kingship. Shamshi-Adad I implemented state reforms that further centralized authority. The construction of a large palace at Ashur, identified through excavated architectural remains, signaled the consolidation of royal power. The installation of his sons as governors in key cities, most notably Ishmi-Dagon in Ekallatum, indicates an early attempt to institute dynastic control over distant territories. Records from this period contain references to standardized tribute systems and coordinated military operations, suggesting that the king sought to align provincial governance with his broader strategic goals. This administrative integration laid structural foundations for the Middle Assyrian state that would emerge centuries later. Despite these achievements, the political order created by Shamshi-Adad I was relatively short-lived. Following his death, local elites and rival kingdoms asserted their independence, and Hammurabi of Babylon eventually absorbed much of his territory. However, the institutional innovations introduced during his rule persisted in Ashur. The experience of managing multiple provinces, codifying administrative roles, and maintaining a centralized palace system prepared Assyria for future phases of state formation. These developments demonstrate how temporary political unification can produce lasting structural effects, even when territorial control is not maintained. The continued activity of Assyrian merchants after Shamshi-Adad's death reinforces the resilience of commercial networks. Even as political boundaries fluctuated, records from the Kanesh archives show that trade continued with relatively little interruption. This continuity highlights the importance of economic stability in supporting political identity. Merchant families adapted quickly to shifting circumstances, negotiating with new rulers and maintaining their long-distance business ventures. Their persistence ensured that Assyria retained financial resources and communication channels that later rulers could draw upon. Archaeological discoveries at Ashur from this period provide additional insight into the city's internal development. Excavations have revealed residential quarters with uniform architectural styles, indicating a stable and organized urban population. Storage facilities, administrative rooms, and expanded fortifications suggest that the city invested heavily in infrastructure. These improvements demonstrate that early autonomy produced tangible changes in urban planning and public administration. The physical transformation of Ashur corresponds with increased political confidence and growing institutional capacity. By the early 18th century BCE, the foundations of an independent Assyrian political identity were firmly established. Local dynasties had exercised sovereignty, integrated merchant networks into governance, and initiated territorial expansion under a centralized ruler. Administrative practices introduced during this period continued to influence Assyria for centuries. These foundations prepared Assyria for the political experiments of the Middle Assyrian Kingdom. With Ashur-uballit I, Assyria announced itself to the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. The accession of Ashur-uballit I around 1365 BCE marked a decisive turning point in Assyrian history. Prior to his reign, Assyria operated as a regional state situated between the larger political systems of Mitanni to the west and Kassite Babylonia to the south. Its influence was primarily confined to the Upper Tigris region, and its political autonomy fluctuated according to the strength of neighboring powers. Ashur-uballit I altered this landscape by asserting full independence from Mitanni control and initiating a series of reforms that reorganized the state's administrative and military foundations. His actions reoriented Assyria from a commercially influenced polity into a centralized territorial kingdom capable of sustained regional engagement. A key source for understanding Ashur-uballit I's international role comes from the Amarna letters, the diplomatic archive discovered at Akhetaten in Egypt. These tablets include correspondence between Ashur-uballit I and Pharaoh Akhenaten, illustrating Assyria's entry into the established network of Late Bronze Age diplomacy. In these letters, Ashur-uballit I addresses the Egyptian king as an equal, an important indicator of Assyria's rising status. The tone and structure of the correspondence align with the conventions used between major powers such as Egypt, Hutti, and Babylonia. This evidence demonstrates that Assyria now claimed a position within the recognized hierarchy of great kings, a distinction that had significant implications for its external relations. Ashur-uballit-I's diplomatic assertions were grounded in his consolidation of territorial control. Contemporary inscriptions report military campaigns conducted against Mitanni-aligned regions, particularly in the Habur and Sabarta districts. These operations weakened Mitanni's ability to exert influence over the Upper Tigris and allowed Assyria to assert direct authority over surrounding towns. Archaeological surveys indicate that several settlements expanded during this period, likely reflecting increased security and centralized oversight. This territorial consolidation provided the material foundation necessary for diplomatic engagement, as control of key routes allowed Assyria to participate in long-distance communication and trade with major states. Administrative restructuring played an essential role in Ashur-uballit-I's state-building program. Records from Assur show the emergence of standardized offices responsible for taxation, judiciary matters, and military provisioning. Seal impressions from administrative buildings exhibit new iconographic patterns emphasizing royal strength and divine legitimacy. The expansion of these offices indicates that Ashur-uballit-I strengthened bureaucratic coordination, ensuring that the state's economic resources could support military and diplomatic objectives. This administrative evolution reflects a shift from earlier merchant-centered governance to a more hierarchical system dominated by the palace. One of the most notable changes during Ashur-uballit-I's reign was the introduction of a distinct royal ideology. Earlier rulers had emphasized their roles as caretakers of Assur's cult, but Ashur-uballit-I expanded this image by portraying himself as a warrior king responsible for defending and expanding the realm. Inscriptions describe him as strong, victorious, and chosen by the god Ashur, linking military achievement to divine mandate. Monumental construction projects, including renovations to temple precincts and fortification walls, reinforced this new ideology. Archaeologists have identified building phases from his reign that correspond to these descriptions, demonstrating that ideological claims were supported by tangible infrastructure. Diplomatic correspondence highlights the geopolitical complexity in which Ashur-uballit-I operated. The Amarna letters record his interventions in Babylonian affairs, including his request that a relative be placed on the Kassite throne following political disturbances. This involvement illustrates a strategic attempt to influence regional power dynamics and secure a favorable southern border. Although this intervention ultimately provoked conflict between Assyria and Babylonia, it indicates that Ashur-uballit-I was willing to leverage diplomatic ties to shape the international environment. His ability to act on this scale further confirms Assyria's transformed status. Control over trade routes remained important during this period, but their management now fell more directly under royal authority. The Upper Tigris Corridor, historically a commercial conduit linking Anatolia and Mesopotamia, became an instrument of state policy. Administrative texts suggest increased taxation of goods moving through Assyrian territory, providing stable revenue for the crown. This development reduced the influence of independent merchant families and integrated economic activity more closely with political objectives. The shift towards centralized economic management strengthened the king's ability to equip armies and maintain diplomatic correspondence, reinforcing Assyria's standing among regional powers. Ashur-uballit-I also pursued internal reforms that shaped the identity of the Middle Assyrian state. The introduction of legal adjustments, portions of which appear in the later Middle Assyrian laws, reflects a growing emphasis on codifying social and administrative norms. These changes aimed to ensure uniform governance across newly expanded territories. They also provided tools for managing diverse populations, as Assyria now incorporated communities with varying legal traditions. The development of these administrative mechanisms demonstrates the state's effort to transition from a localized kingdom into a multi-regional polity. The reign of Ashur-uballit-I ended with a kingdom more cohesive and internationally recognized than at any previous point in Assyrian history. Assyria had secured independence from Mitanni, expanded its territory, and entered into diplomatic relations with Egypt and other major states. Administrative reforms had strengthened the palace, while royal ideology presented the king as both protector and promoter of Assyria's interests. These changes laid the structural foundations for subsequent rulers, who built upon his advances to further extend Assyria's influence. By the late 14th century BCE, the Middle Assyrian state possessed the administrative capacity, territorial security, and diplomatic recognition required to participate fully in late Bronze Age geopolitics. International recognition enabled Assyria to strengthen its military and administrative systems. The consolidation of Assyrian power after the reign of Ashur-uballit created the conditions for a more systematic military apparatus, one that would define the Middle Assyrian state from the late 14th to the early 12th centuries BCE. The reigns of Adad-nirari I, circa 1307 to 1275 BCE, Shalmaneser I, circa 1274 to 1245 BCE, and ultimately Tukulti-Ninurta I, circa 1244 to 1208 BCE, mark the emergence of a force no longer dependent on ad hoc mobilization but increasingly organized around standardized units, regulated obligations, and an expanding territorial base capable of sustaining continuous campaigns. Royal inscriptions, palace archives, and later compilations such as the Assyrian King List collectively illustrate how administrative centralization and military reform advanced in parallel. The result was a state capable of projecting power far beyond the upper Tigris, altering the political geography of northern Mesopotamia. Adad-nirari I's early campaigns against what remained of the Mitanni polity are central to understanding this transformation. By the 14th century BCE, Mitanni had already fractured under Hittite pressure, yet it remained a significant regional rival. Assyrian records describe a sequence of engagements culminating in the subjugation of key fortress cities, such as Taidu, Eridu, and Washukani. These successes were possible partly because the Assyrians had refined the integration of chariotry with massed infantry. Chariot contingents, while still small in absolute numbers by later standards, were deployed with improved coordination, functioning as shock units and command platforms. Infantry forces, drawn through landholding and labor obligations, were increasingly organized into defined ranks and equipped in more uniform fashion. Although these reforms do not yet reflect the full professionalization of the Neo-Assyrian period, they represent a substantial change from the earlier merchant city structure, in which military obligations were more loosely administered. The economic implications of these victories were equally significant. Each campaign brought tribute, land, and captives, all of which fed into palace-directed building projects and agricultural initiatives. Texts from the period document the establishment of state farms, expanded irrigation systems, and newly fortified administrative centers. This economic expansion strengthened the Assyrian state's ability to maintain larger armies for longer durations. The pattern evident under Adad-nirari I, military success enabling economic growth, which then financed further military campaigns, became a defining characteristic of Assyrian statecraft. Shalmaneser I continued this trajectory by pushing deeper into the former Mitanni sphere and reorganizing conquered territories into a more stable administrative framework. His inscriptions record the destruction of Arinu, a symbolic act demonstrating the dismantling of Mitanni identity. Assyrian control over the Habur and Middle Euphrates regions meant access to key agricultural plains and strategic road networks. With these acquisitions, Assyria had effectively eliminated its northern competitor and secured the logistical foundations for campaigns farther south. Shalmaneser I also strengthened the institutional discipline of the army, imposing penalties for desertion and formalizing the relationship between land allotments and military service. When combined with new fortresses and transport routes, these measures contributed to an increasingly predictable mobilization structure, an essential feature of a state engaged in nearly constant warfare. The scale of military ambition expanded further under Tukulti-Ninurta I, one of the most aggressive rulers of the Middle Assyrian era. Early in his reign, he campaigned across the Zagros frontier, subduing Hurrian groups and reinforcing Assyrian control of upland routes. His most consequential campaigns, however, targeted Babylonia. The long-standing rivalry between Assyria and Babylon, intermittently shaped by diplomacy and conflict, moved decisively toward confrontation when Tukulti-Ninurta asserted claims over disputed borderlands. Royal inscriptions, though propagandistic, describe a series of engagements culminating in the defeat, capture, and deposition of the Babylonian king Kashtiliash-IV. Tukulti-Ninurta's conquest of Babylon around 1225 BCE stands out as a pivotal moment in Near Eastern political history. For the first time, an Assyrian king held direct authority over the southern cultural heartland of Mesopotamia. This victory did more than extend Assyrian territory. It also demonstrated the operational maturity of the Middle Assyrian military system. Siege warfare, an area in which Assyria would later become renowned, was already an identifiable component of the state's capabilities. Evidence from relief fragments and textual references suggests the use of ramp building, battering devices, and sustained blockades. The army's ability to coordinate multi-month operations far from the Assyrian core indicates improved logistical planning, supported by the broadened agricultural and administrative base developed over the previous century. The political and ideological consequences of the Babylonian conquest were expressed through large-scale construction projects. Tukulti-Ninurta founded a new capital, Tukulti-Ninurta, on the east bank of the Tigris. Excavations reveal a meticulously planned city, complete with administrative complexes, temples, and residential districts. While the site was only briefly inhabited, it reflects a broader pattern. Major military successes were followed by projects intended to display royal legitimacy and divine sanction. The surplus generated from tributary territories and captured labor facilitated these endeavors. In effect, military achievement directly financed the monumental landscape of the Middle Assyrian state. Despite its successes, the system was not without limitations. The extension of Assyrian control into Babylonia proved difficult to sustain. Internal opposition, elite rivalries, and local resistance eroded the gains achieved by Tukulti-Ninurta. His assassination, attributed in later sources to a palace conspiracy, marked the beginning of a period of instability. Nevertheless, the institutional foundations built across the 13th century BCE remained intact. The army retained its standardized structure, the administrative apparatus continued to function, and the ideological framework portraying the king as conqueror and builder persisted. The achievements of Adad-nirari I, Shalmaneser I, and Tukulti-Ninurta I collectively demonstrate how military organization and territorial expansion transformed Assyria into the predominant northern power of the Late Bronze Age. By refining army structure, incorporating new siege methods, and integrating conquered regions into an increasingly centralized system, Middle Assyria established models that would later be amplified during the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The precedents set in this period, standardized forces, administrative consolidation, and the link between conquest and state development, formed the structural basis of Assyria's subsequent rise to imperial dominance. The emergence of a durable Middle Assyrian state depended not only on military expansion but also on the creation of administrative and legal structures that could regulate a growing and diverse population. By the 13th century BCE, the territorial gains achieved under Adad-nirari I, Shalmaneser I, and Tukulti-Ninurta I required governance mechanisms far more complex than those used in the earlier merchant-based city-state. The Middle Assyrian laws, palace archives, and archaeological evidence from centers such as Ashur and Tukulti-Ninurta indicate the formation of a bureaucratic system designed to standardize social conduct, manage agricultural resources, and integrate newly conquered regions into the state framework. These developments gave Assyria an administrative cohesion that endured beyond the reigns of individual rulers. The Middle Assyrian laws, preserved on tablets discovered primarily at Ashur, are central to understanding the legal environment of this period. Though not a comprehensive code in the sense of Hammurabi's laws, they functioned as a compilation of regulations addressing social behavior, property rights, and state control. Many provisions relate to gender norms and family structure, revealing a society in which patriarchal authority was strongly reinforced by legal sanction. Regulations concerning marriage, inheritance, veiling, adultery, and sexual offenses structured social boundaries and prescribed strict penalties for transgression. These laws, while reflecting earlier Mesopotamian traditions, differ in their emphasis on state-enforced discipline and the visibility of social hierarchy. The text indicates a legal system that aimed to define acceptable behavior with considerable precision and to ensure that violations were met with predictable, often severe, consequences. Property and land tenure are also central themes in the Middle Assyrian laws. As Assyria expanded, conquered territories were reorganized into estates administered by the crown, the palace, or military elites. Land was frequently granted as fiefs in exchange for service obligations, especially military service. These allotments linked economic production with the administrative and defense needs of the state. The palace oversaw large agricultural estates worked by dependent laborers, war captives, and tenant farmers who owed a portion of their produce to the state. Records from Ashur document detailed accounting practices, tracking grain deliveries, herd sizes, labor quotas, and tax obligations. Such documentation reflects an increasingly structured bureaucracy capable of monitoring economic output across multiple regions. The administrative hierarchy that managed these systems drew from long-standing Mesopotamian precedents but grew more elaborate under the Middle Assyrian kings. Central oversight resided in the palace, where officials supervised taxation, judicial matters, temple revenues, and provisioning for the army. Titles such as Kalhu, chief minister, and Rabbalani, district governor, appear frequently in inscriptions, suggesting a multi-tiered structure that coordinated labor, maintained order, and ensured the steady flow of resources to the capital. Governors administered provincial centers, collected tribute, and enforced royal directives. Their authority depended on both hereditary prestige and royal appointment, blending traditional elite lineages with the expanding needs of the state. Judicial institutions further reinforced administrative control. Court proceedings, documented in tablets from Ashur and other sites, reveal a system in which local officials, elders, and sometimes royal agents adjudicated disputes. Matters ranged from property conflicts and marital issues to commercial disagreements and criminal accusations. The procedures emphasized the use of oaths, witness testimony, and prescribed penalties. While the king served as the ultimate legal authority, most cases appear to have been resolved locally, demonstrating an administrative network that functioned with considerable autonomy but within clearly defined legal norms. Archaeological evidence from Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta, founded during the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I, illustrates the physical expression of this administrative order. Unlike older urban centers that developed organically, this city was laid out according to a predetermined plan. Excavations reveal a spacious palace complex, granaries, residential quarters, and a large temple precinct, features consistent with a center designed to manage labor, storage, and redistribution. The city's scale and organization reflect the state's capacity to mobilize resources and personnel on a large scale. Although Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta declined soon after the king's death, its remains preserve a snapshot of the administrative ambitions of the Middle Assyrian state. Military obligations were deeply integrated into this administrative framework. Land allotments, labor responsibilities, and tax duties were intertwined with service requirements. The army drew heavily from provincial populations, and officials were responsible for ensuring that men, equipment, and supplies were available when campaigns were launched. Tablets documenting the distribution of weapons and rations demonstrate the extent to which the bureaucracy standardized the mobilization process. This integration of military and administrative functions allowed Assyria to sustain prolonged campaigns, even during periods of internal stress. When considered together, the Middle Assyrian legal texts, administrative records, and archaeological remains reveal a state committed to formalizing authority across multiple domains. Legal codification reinforced social hierarchy and behavioral norms. Bureaucratic structures enabled taxation, labor management, and agricultural expansion. Planned urban projects expressed the centralizing aspirations of the monarchy. These systems provided stability even when political conditions shifted, giving Assyria continuity through generational transitions. However, these institutions were not immune to strain. The territorial overreach following the conquest of Babylonia, combined with internal competition among elites, soon exposed the limits of centralized control and set the stage for a period of fragmentation that challenged the durability of the Middle Assyrian system. The Late Bronze Age collapse, extending roughly between 1200 and 1050 BCE, reshaped political systems across the Near East. Major palace economies in Anatolia, Syria, and the Aegean disintegrated under the combined pressures of disrupted trade, population dislocation, and structural fragility. While Hutti, Ugarit, Alalak, and Mycenaean Greece experienced rapid destruction or abandonment, Assyria maintained political continuity. Royal inscriptions and later chronicles indicate that the Middle Assyrian state contracted geographically, but preserved its core administrative centers at Ashur, Nineveh, and Kalhu. The comparative survival of these cities suggests that Assyria possessed economic and institutional buffers that mitigated the systemic failures affecting neighboring regions. Texts from the reigns of Tukulti-Ninurta II and his successors emphasize the persistence of agricultural production along the Tigris corridor. The region's irrigated farmlands were less dependent on long-distance trade than the palace economies of western Anatolia and northern Syria. Grain deliveries, livestock records, and storage accounts from Ashur and associated sites show continuity in the state's capacity to collect and redistribute food surpluses. This stability insulated Assyria from the collapse of international exchange networks that had supplied bronze, luxury goods, and specialized crafts to other late Bronze Age powers. The resilience of the agrarian base provided a material foundation for the endurance of the state. Archaeological comparisons with Hittite centers illustrate the significance of this divergence. At Hattusa, destruction layers and abandoned archives mark the sudden end of administrative function around the early 12th century BCE. In contrast, Assyrian cities show evidence of continued construction and maintenance, though on a reduced scale. Excavations at Ashur indicate ongoing repair of fortifications and palace structures, suggesting that the ruling elite retained control over labor mobilization. The absence of widespread conflagration and abandonment indicates that Assyria faced pressure but not institutional collapse. One of the primary external challenges during this period came from the movements of Aramean groups. Royal inscriptions refer repeatedly to incursions across the Euphrates and into the Tigris River basin. These groups, lacking centralized leadership but capable of rapid movement, disrupted established settlement patterns and created constant pressure on Assyria's western frontier. Their incursions into agricultural districts and caravan routes forced the state to shift from expansionary campaigns to defensive operations. The texts describe raids on villages, the need to secure river crossings, and the construction or reinforcement of outposts along key routes. This defensive orientation marked a significant departure from the aggressive campaigns that characterized earlier Middle Assyrian kings. The reorganization of settlements in the Upper Tigris region reflects the impact of these pressures. Surveys conducted in the Tigris Basin document the decline of large, centralized sites and the rise of smaller, more defensible villages. This change indicates a regional response to insecurity that Assyria had to address through both military and administrative measures. The persistence of fortified provincial centers, however, demonstrates that Assyrian authority remained intact in its core territories. Records describing the movements of officials, the issuance of orders, and the collection of tribute show that the administrative structure continued to function despite external disruptions. Assyria's strategic adaptation during this period is evident in its military responses. Rather than large-scale conquests, campaigns focused on containing Aramean raids, securing borderlands, and preserving access to vital agricultural zones. Royal inscriptions highlight punitive expeditions across the Euphrates and efforts to prevent the establishment of permanent Aramean settlements near Assyrian-controlled regions. These measures aimed to stabilize frontier areas rather than expand the state's territorial reach. This shift illustrates how Assyria recalibrated its military priorities to preserve the essential components of state power. Another factor contributing to Assyria's resilience was its diversified economic structure. While long-distance trade diminished, the state still controlled agricultural output, textile production, animal husbandry, and local craft industries. Storage facilities and distribution systems in Ashur and Nineveh ensured that essential goods remained available even as international exchange declined. The presence of standardized weights, seals, and administrative tablets from this period suggests that the internal economy continued to operate with predictable oversight. This diversification contrasts with the dependence on international exchange seen in cities like Ugarit, where the interruption of trade quickly undermined political authority. Environmental stability along the Tigris may also have supported Assyria's endurance. Although evidence for climatic change during this period remains debated, core Assyrian territories show no clear signs of widespread ecological stress. The viability of irrigation systems and the continuity of crop cycles provided a foundation for sustaining population centers. Combined with functioning administrative institutions, these conditions enabled the state to absorb external shocks without disintegration. By the end of the 11th century BCE, Assyria had not expanded its influence but had preserved its essential structures. The ability to adapt militarily, maintain agricultural production, and sustain administrative organization positioned the state for renewed activity in the following centuries. As regional conditions stabilized and neighboring powers reorganized, Assyria's preserved core allowed it to reassert control over surrounding territories and initiate the processes that would lead to the formation of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The 11th and 10th centuries BCE marked a period in which Assyria confronted persistent pressure from Aramean groups dispersing across northern Mesopotamia. Royal inscriptions from the era reference repeated incursions, raids on agricultural districts, and attempts by mobile tribal confederations to occupy territories once integrated into the Middle Assyrian state. Archaeological surveys in the Khabur Basin and Upper Tigris region show a noticeable shift from large, centralized settlements to smaller and more scattered sites, reflecting a regional response to instability. While Assyria did not collapse, the state experienced a prolonged contraction, withdrawing into a defensive posture centered around Ashur, Nineveh, and the surrounding agricultural heartland. Aramean communities, lacking centralized political authority, moved in dispersed groups that disrupted established administrative boundaries. Contemporary inscriptions convey the difficulty of confronting adversaries who did not rely on fixed urban bases. Their mobility allowed them to strike farmland, water sources, and transport routes, undermining predictable patterns of agricultural production. The Khabur region, once an important Middle Assyrian administrative zone, shows evidence of reduced population density during this period. Settlement data indicate that many sites formerly tied to the Assyrian tribute and tax networks were either abandoned or diminished in size. This contraction represented both a symptom of regional insecurity and a challenge to Assyrian authority. Despite these pressures, the administrative structures in core Assyrian cities remained functional. Textual evidence from Ashur confirms that royal offices continued to issue orders, collect foodstuffs, and oversee temple operations. Although diminished in scope, the persistence of these institutions provided a framework for eventual recovery. The ability to maintain internal administrative coherence distinguished Assyria from polities that had fully disintegrated during the broader Late Bronze Age crisis. Royal inscriptions from this period emphasize the continuity of cultic practices, particularly at the temple of the god Ashur, suggesting that ritual stability helped sustain political legitimacy during times of territorial loss. The reign of Ashur-dan II, 934 to 912 BCE, marked a turning point in these dynamics. His inscriptions describe systematic efforts to reclaim agricultural zones previously occupied or disrupted by Aramean groups. Campaign accounts detail operations aimed at securing river crossings along the Tigris and Khabur, re-establishing safe conditions for cultivation, and restoring the movement of goods between towns. Rather than initiating long-range conquest, Ashur-dan II focused on reasserting control over areas within a relatively close radius of the core cities. This strategy reflects a deliberate attempt to rebuild the economic foundations of the state before engaging in broader territorial expansion. The restoration of arable land was central to these efforts. Textual records from this period emphasize the clearing of abandoned fields and the reorganization of rural communities. Recovered farmlands increased state revenue through grain levies and agricultural dues, enabling the palace to provision officials, military personnel, and temple institutions. Archaeologists have noted indications of revived irrigation activity along tributaries of the Tigris, suggesting that local labor was mobilized to restore channels and waterworks damaged or neglected during periods of insecurity. The focus on agricultural reconstruction reveals the state's understanding that reliable food production was essential for rebuilding administrative capacity. The military campaigns of Ashur II also aimed to stabilize key trade routes. Although long-distance commerce had not fully recovered from earlier disruptions, regional exchanges in textiles, grain, metals, and livestock remained economically significant. Securing roads connecting Assur to northern and western districts helped re-establish predictable flows of goods. Royal inscriptions reference the reopening of caravan routes and the enhancement of security along paths frequently targeted by Aramean raiders. These measures not only supported economic recovery but also projected renewed royal authority into contested areas. Aramean groups continued to influence the cultural and linguistic landscape during this period. Their increasing presence across the Levant and Mesopotamia contributed to the spread of Aramaic as a widely used language. Administrative tablets and seals from later centuries indicate a gradual rise in Aramaic personal names and linguistic features within Assyrian-controlled regions. Although Akkadian remained the official language of state administration, the diffusion of Aramaic illustrates the demographic and cultural impact of these groups. The interactions between settled Assyrian populations and mobile Aramean communities shaped the social environment in which the Neo-Assyrian Empire would later operate. By the late 10th century BCE, Assyria's efforts to stabilize its territories began to yield measurable results. Settlement surveys show a modest increase in occupied sites near the core region, reflecting renewed security and agricultural viability. While the state's borders did not match those of the earlier Middle Assyrian period, the recovered farmland and restructured administrative districts provided the essential resources for military and political resurgence. Ashur II's successors inherited a reorganized territorial base that facilitated the expansionist policies of later rulers, such as Adad-nirari II and Tukulti-Ninurta II. The prolonged interaction between Assyria and Aramean groups also influenced military strategy. Campaign narratives from this period describe efforts to prevent the formation of entrenched Aramean settlements near the Tigris. The construction of small forts, garrisons, and signal posts indicates a more systematic approach to frontier management than in previous centuries. This emphasis on defensive infrastructure reflects lessons learned during the prolonged struggle for territorial stability. The experience of confronting mobile adversaries informed later Neo-Assyrian military reforms, which emphasized rapid deployment, fortified bases, and the integration of auxiliary troops drawn from conquered regions. Assyria's retrenchment during the 11th and 10th centuries BCE demonstrates the state's capacity to reorganize under sustained external pressure. While territorial losses were significant, the preservation of core administrative structures, the revitalization of agricultural zones, and the restoration of regional trade networks allowed the kingdom to reassert itself. This recovery formed the basis for the wider imperial expansion that would follow in the 9th century. As territorial consolidation continued, Assyria was positioned to transition from a defensive posture to the assertive strategies that defined its emergence as a dominant Near Eastern power. The Neo-Assyrian rise began with methodical restoration, not rapid expansion. The period immediately preceding the reign of Adad-nirari II, 911 to 891 BCE, demonstrates that Assyria's emergence as a regional power in the early first millennium BCE was rooted in deliberate institutional and territorial recovery. Successive kings, often overlooked in traditional narratives, focused on reestablishing agricultural productivity, stabilizing core cities, and reorganizing provincial administration. Textual evidence from palace archives, administrative tablets, and royal inscriptions reveals that these efforts prioritized sustainable state capacity over opportunistic conquest, laying the groundwork for what would become the Neo-Assyrian Empire. By the late 10th century BCE, the core territories along the Upper Tigris, Assur, Nineveh, and surrounding districts had been secured against Aramean incursions. Administrative records show that officials oversaw the repair of canals, the reclamation of fallow land, and the restoration of granaries that had fallen into disuse during periods of instability. This emphasis on agricultural infrastructure ensured stable revenue streams for the crown and provided the logistical basis for future military campaigns. Tablets recording crop yields, rations, and tribute distributions illustrate a continuity in bureaucratic oversight that had survived the late Bronze Age collapse and subsequent territorial contractions. Such documentation indicates a state attentive to economic planning and the provision of resources to both urban and rural populations. Provincial governance was simultaneously reorganized. Officials, appointed in both hereditary and merit-based capacities, administered smaller districts under the supervision of the palace. Royal inscriptions highlight the rebuilding of administrative centers at key nodes along the Tigris and its tributaries. These centers functioned as both economic hubs and sites of judicial oversight. The codification of local legal practices, derived in part from the Middle Assyrian laws, reinforced the authority of provincial administrators and provided mechanisms for managing diverse populations. This administrative consolidation ensured that Assyria could mobilize manpower, levy taxes, and enforce regulations efficiently, even in territories previously destabilized by Aramean settlement. Temple construction and religious revitalization formed another component of state restoration. Archaeological evidence from Ashur and Nimrud shows extensive rebuilding of temples and cultic facilities. Inscriptions from this period record dedications to the god Ashur and the reinstitution of annual festivals, reinforcing both divine legitimacy and centralized control. Temple estates not only served religious functions but were integral to economic administration, providing storage, employment, and redistribution of resources. The revival of religious infrastructure thus served a dual purpose, re-establishing ritual continuity and sustaining the material apparatus of the state. Military organization was gradually reinforced alongside these administrative and economic reforms. Records indicate the recruitment and training of infantry and chariot contingents drawn from provincial populations, combined with the maintenance of garrisons at strategic locations along frontier zones. Kings preceding Adad-nirari II prioritized securing trade routes and key river crossings, ensuring the safe transport of goods and personnel. The coordination between agricultural production, tribute collection, and military provisioning reflects a systemic approach to state building in which military readiness was dependent on domestic stability. The restoration of Assyria's territorial and economic base enabled renewed engagement with neighboring powers, particularly Babylonia. Inscriptions describe diplomatic contacts and border patrols that stabilized southern frontiers, preventing repeated incursions and ensuring access to fertile lands. This careful attention to regional balance illustrates that Assyria's rise was not solely a product of military aggression but also of strategic governance. Restored border zones functioned as buffers against nomadic and semi-nomadic groups, while facilitating the resumption of trade with southern Mesopotamian cities, including Babylonian polities and intermediaries in the Diyala and Euphrates corridors. Long-distance trade, which had suffered during the Late Bronze Age collapse, began to recover as merchants and state officials coordinated the transport of metals, textiles, and other commodities. Excavated tablets document commodity exchanges and the imposition of tariffs, suggesting that economic revival was systematically integrated into state planning. The coordination of commerce, taxation, and border security reflects a state consciously reinforcing the economic foundations necessary for sustained territorial expansion. Collectively, these measures demonstrate that the Neo-Assyrian Empire did not emerge spontaneously as a result of military conquest but was the product of deliberate, incremental rebuilding. By stabilizing agriculture, reorganizing administration, restoring religious and civic infrastructure, and reinforcing military capacity, the kings preceding Adad-nirari II created the institutional resilience necessary for expansive campaigns. Their efforts ensured that the state could project authority beyond its core territories, respond effectively to external threats, and integrate diverse populations under a centralized governance framework. By the time Adad-nirari II assumed the throne in 911 BCE, Assyria had achieved a structural and territorial coherence absent for nearly 2 centuries. The combination of stabilized farmland, fortified cities, reorganized provinces, and renewed economic networks provided the platform for military and diplomatic initiatives. These foundational reforms explain why the Neo-Assyrian Empire could transition swiftly from defensive recovery to assertive expansion in the 9th century BCE. With the state restructured and its core resources secured, Assyria was poised to enter its most transformative era, setting the stage for systematic territorial conquest, administrative innovation, and regional dominance that would define the first millennium BCE. Assyria's new era opened with systematic campaigns that reshaped the northern Mesopotamian landscape. The ascension of Adad-nirari II in 911 BCE marks a decisive turning point in Assyrian history. Following the period of territorial retrenchment and administrative rebuilding, the Neo-Assyrian state was positioned to transition from defensive consolidation to proactive expansion. Royal inscriptions, combined with Babylonian chronicles, indicate that his early campaigns focused on reasserting control over the Habur region and securing borders with Babylonia, regions that had been destabilized by Aramean incursions and local fragmentation during the preceding century. These campaigns were conducted not as sporadic raids but as methodically planned operations integrating military, administrative, and economic objectives. Adad-nirari II's inscriptions describe the systematic subjugation of key city-states and tribal polities across northern Mesopotamia. Cities such as Taidu, Geser, and Shatakani were brought under Assyrian control through a combination of direct military engagement, garrisoning, and negotiated submission. The king's accounts emphasize the capture of spoils and the collection of tribute, which served a dual function, demonstrating the reach of royal authority and reinforcing the palace economy. Administrative tablets indicate that tribute consisted of agricultural produce, livestock, textiles, and precious metals, all of which were channeled into state-controlled stores to support further campaigns and public construction. The flow of resources allowed the palace not only to provision military units but also to fund temple restorations and urban infrastructure in Ashur, Nineveh, and emerging provincial centers. These early campaigns also illustrate the development of a distinctive Neo-Assyrian operational model. Unlike earlier Middle Assyrian expeditions, which focused primarily on conquest, Adad-nirari II's military actions integrated punitive objectives with long-term administrative planning. Inscriptions detail how captured towns were often transformed into provincial centers, with appointed officials responsible for tribute collection, local policing, and infrastructure repair. This process of systematic provincial incorporation strengthened Assyrian control without relying solely on permanent occupation by military garrisons. The coordination of administrative and military measures ensured that newly subdued areas contributed to the state's stability and economic capacity. Border relations with Babylonia were particularly significant during this period. Assyrian sources indicate that Adad-nirari II conducted operations to prevent incursions by southern polities and to reassert Assyrian influence over contested territories in the Diyala and Euphrates corridors. Babylonian chronicles, although fragmentary, confirm Assyrian activity in regions previously outside firm Assyrian control. These engagements established a pattern of frontier management in which military action, diplomatic negotiation, and economic oversight were combined to secure strategic objectives. By stabilizing the southern border, Adad-nirari II created conditions for a sustainable expansion northward and westward. The economic ramifications of renewed expansion were immediate and substantial. The collection of tribute from newly incorporated regions increased the palace's capacity to maintain standing forces and support administrative apparatuses. Archaeological evidence from urban centers under Assyrian control suggests that increased resource inflows financed the repair and enlargement of temples, granaries, and palace complexes. These projects reinforced the king's legitimacy while simultaneously embedding state authority within the built environment. The integration of economic, military, and administrative functions during this period demonstrates a systemic approach to state consolidation that would characterize later Neo-Assyrian practice. In addition to territorial and economic consolidation, Adad-nirari II's campaigns helped redefine Assyria's relations with tribal polities. The king's inscriptions describe the subjugation of Aramean and Hurrian groups, many of whom had previously contested Assyrian authority along the northern frontiers. By imposing tribute obligations, securing loyalty from local leaders, and occasionally relocating populations, Assyria reduced the threat of disruption and integrated these groups into the imperial system. This strategy reflects an early recognition of the importance of controlling peripheral populations, a principle that would later underpin the Neo-Assyrian approach to imperial governance. The king's efforts also established precedents for the scale and organization of military campaigns in the Neo-Assyrian state. Forces were coordinated along multiple axes, combining infantry, chariotry, and newly standardized siege capabilities. Campaigns were timed to ensure that supply lines and tribute collection could support operations across multiple seasons. These logistical refinements, documented in administrative records, illustrate the increasing professionalization of the Assyrian military apparatus. The ability to conduct repeated, coordinated campaigns over a broad geographic area allowed the state to enforce authority and project power more reliably than in the Middle Assyrian period. By the end of Adad-nirari II's reign, the foundations of a durable imperial system were firmly in place. Core territories were stabilized, economic and tribute systems were reinforced, and the integration of conquered regions into the administrative framework created a coherent state capable of sustained expansion. The systematic combination of military, administrative, and economic strategies during these campaigns marks a decisive innovation in Assyrian statecraft. Expansion was no longer episodic or opportunistic but methodically planned, with mechanisms for consolidating and institutionalizing conquest. These developments established a template for subsequent rulers, who would extend Assyria's reach further into northern Mesopotamia, the Levant, and beyond. The early Neo-Assyrian pattern, punitive expeditions, tribute extraction, and provincial incorporation, provided a structural model for empire building that relied on the deliberate integration of military, economic, and administrative systems. With these foundations secured, the state was prepared to enter the era of full imperial expansion, a transformation that would define the next centuries of Near Eastern history. With Ashur-nirpal II, Assyria developed the visual and ideological language of empire. The reign of Ashur-nirpal II, 883 to 859 BCE, represents a critical phase in the consolidation of Neo-Assyrian power, during which military conquest, administrative reform, and monumental art coalesced to define the ideological foundations of empire. Building upon the territorial recovery achieved by his predecessors, Ashur-nirpal II undertook systematic campaigns across the Levant, northern Mesopotamia, and the Zagros frontier, securing tribute and extending Assyrian influence. Inscriptions from his reign, particularly those associated with the northwest palace at Kalhu, modern Nimrud, document both the scope of these campaigns and the methods by which conquered territories were incorporated into the imperial system. These records demonstrate that his rule emphasized not only coercion and military prowess but also administrative integration and ideological projection. Archaeological evidence from Nimrud underscores the scale and ambition of Ashur-nirpal II's urban and architectural projects. The Northwest Palace, excavated extensively in the 20th century, reveals a complex of audience halls, private chambers, and ceremonial spaces, all decorated with carved alabaster reliefs depicting the king's military victories. The reliefs portray battles, siege operations, and tribute processions with precise iconography, establishing a visual vocabulary that associated the king directly with divine sanction and martial authority. Inscriptions carved alongside these images frequently invoke the god Ashur, portraying the king as the god's chosen agent on earth. This integration of textual and visual propaganda communicated a clear political message. Imperial authority was both divinely mandated and militarily enforced. Military campaigns during Ashur-nirpal II's reign were meticulously planned and widely publicized. Royal inscriptions enumerate victories over Aramean tribes, Neo-Hittite states, and other regional polities, often detailing the number of cities captured, soldiers defeated, and captives deported. Unlike earlier periods in Assyrian history, these accounts provide specific quantitative data, emphasizing the scope of operations and the effectiveness of centralized coordination. Deportation policies, in particular, served multiple purposes: removing potential resistance, redistributing labor to benefit the state, and facilitating cultural integration within Assyrian-controlled territories. Excavated archives from provincial centers indicate that deportees were assigned to agricultural estates, urban construction projects, and temple maintenance, demonstrating the administrative capacity to mobilize populations for state objectives. The relocation of populations and integration of conquered regions were closely tied to the administration of tribute and resource management. Tablets recovered from Kalhu and other sites record the collection of agricultural produce, textiles, metals, and other goods, confirming the systematic extraction of resources from subordinate territories. These inflows supported both the royal court and military apparatus, while also financing large-scale construction projects within the capital. By integrating economic management with political and military control, Ashur-Nisirpal II established a model in which provincial incorporation reinforced the state's capacity to project power across an expanding geographic area. Ashur-Nisirpal II's approach to city-building further reflects the ideological dimension of his reign. Nimrud was deliberately constructed as a display of centralized authority and divine favor. The Northwest Palace was organized along axial and hierarchical principles, with monumental entranceways, grand audience halls, and ceremonial courtyards designed to impress visiting envoys, subordinate rulers, and local elites. Relief programs within the palace reinforced the king's role as conqueror and builder, portraying him overseeing military campaigns, receiving tribute, and performing cultic functions. Excavation reports indicate that these visual programs extended to other public buildings and temples, creating a cohesive architectural narrative that reinforced both administrative order and ideological legitimacy. Inscriptions and reliefs also reveal a calculated use of terror and spectacle to communicate authority. Descriptions of defeated enemies, some showing deported captives, others depicting executed prisoners, served as warnings to potential adversaries while legitimizing the king's actions within a cosmological framework. By presenting military success as an extension of divine will, Ashur-Nisirpal II integrated coercive power with religious ideology. This dual approach provided the Neo-Assyrian state with a coherent rationale for expansion, linking conquest, tribute collection, and administrative oversight into a single narrative of justified authority. Administrative reforms under Ashur-Nisirpal II reinforced these ideological and military initiatives. Provincial governance was formalized, with appointed governors responsible for taxation, local security, and enforcement of royal directives. Officials were tasked with monitoring trade, agricultural production, and population movements, ensuring that the king's policies were implemented efficiently. Archival tablets indicate that reporting mechanisms were standardized, allowing the central palace to maintain oversight over distant territories. This bureaucratic system enhanced the state's ability to sustain expansion, secure economic resources, and respond to both internal and external challenges. Religious infrastructure played a complementary role in consolidating authority. Ashur-Nisirpal II invested heavily in the construction and renovation of temples dedicated to Ashur and other cultic centers within the empire. Temple estates, often staffed by personnel drawn from deported populations, functioned as economic as well as religious institutions. The integration of ritual activity with urban and provincial administration reinforced the perception of divine sanction for the king's rule. Inscriptions frequently emphasized that both construction projects and military victories were undertaken at the behest of Ashur, reinforcing the inseparability of religious legitimacy and political authority. The combination of visual, administrative, and military strategies during Ashur-Nisirpal II's reign established enduring precedents for Neo-Assyrian imperial ideology. By coordinating campaigns, tribute, population management, and monumental architecture, the king created a systemic approach to empire building in which conquest was immediately linked to consolidation and symbolic representation. The integration of these elements ensured that the state could maintain authority over diverse populations while projecting power beyond its core territories. By the end of Ashur-Nisirpal II's reign, the Neo-Assyrian state had been transformed. The Northwest Palace at Nimrud symbolized centralized authority, while provincial incorporation, tribute administration, and military organization established functional mechanisms for maintaining and extending control. Monumental reliefs and inscriptions provided a visual and textual articulation of imperial ideology, portraying the king simultaneously as warrior, builder, and representative of the god Ashur. These innovations would shape the political, religious, and cultural framework of the empire for generations, setting the stage for the further territorial and administrative expansion achieved by his successors. The system Ashur-Nisirpal II built, combining ideological, administrative, and military elements, created a durable template for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Subsequent kings would inherit a state capable of integrating newly conquered territories efficiently, projecting authority across large distances, and reinforcing legitimacy through both ritual and spectacle. The reign of Ashur-Nisirpal II thus represents the crystallization of imperial kingship, defining the visual and institutional language that would characterize Assyrian dominance throughout the first millennium BCE. Under Shalmaneser III, Assyria confronted the Western alliance system head-on. The reign of Shalmaneser III, 859 to 824 BCE, represents a critical phase in the Neo-Assyrian Empire's westward expansion, as the state extended its influence into Syria, the Levant, and the complex network of polities that had long resisted centralized control. Building on the territorial consolidation achieved by Ashur-Nisirpal II, Shalmaneser III conducted a series of campaigns designed to assert dominance over both urban centers and semi-nomadic groups along Assyria's western frontiers. Textual and monumental evidence, particularly the Kirk monolith and the Black Obelisk, provides a detailed record of military engagements, tributary arrangements, and political interactions, illustrating both the strategic ambitions of the Assyrian monarchy and the challenges inherent in sustained Western operations. One of the most significant events of Shalmaneser III's early reign was the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, a confrontation documented on the Kirk monolith. This engagement involved a coalition of 12 kings, including Hadadezer of Aram-Damascus, Irulani of Hamath, and Ahab of Israel, who collectively resisted Assyrian penetration into the Levantine corridor. The monolith enumerates the size of opposing forces, including infantry, chariots, and auxiliary units, offering one of the earliest detailed accounts of coalition warfare in the region. Although Assyrian sources portray the battle as a demonstration of Shalmaneser's military prowess, historians note that the resistance inflicted significant delays and logistical challenges, highlighting the complexities of projecting power over long distances and against coordinated regional alliances. Shalmaneser III's campaigns were not limited to direct military confrontation. The Black Obelisk, erected at Nimrud, provides extensive documentation of tribute from a range of Western polities, including Jehu of Israel. These inscriptions indicate that Assyrian influence was maintained through a combination of coercion, diplomacy, and structured tribute networks. Conquered or subordinated cities were incorporated into the imperial system via the appointment of local governors and the imposition of taxation and resource obligations. Archaeological excavations at Tel Barsip, modern Tel Ahmar, and other sites along the Euphrates reveal administrative buildings, fortifications, and evidence of population resettlement, corroborating textual claims and demonstrating the integration of Western territories into the Assyrian provincial framework. The expansion into Syria and the Levant imposed significant demands on internal Assyrian resources. Sustained military campaigns required extensive provisioning of troops, the maintenance of garrisons, and coordination of supply chains across diverse terrains. Administrative records indicate that revenues collected from newly subjugated areas were essential to support the logistical infrastructure required for these operations. Despite the strain, these campaigns facilitated the establishment of a tributary economy that extended Assyrian control indirectly, allowing the state to extract resources without maintaining permanent, large-scale occupation across every territory. This approach reflects the adaptive capacity of Assyrian administration in managing expansive campaigns over long distances. Shalmaneser III's interactions with Levantine polities also illustrate the negotiation of political authority in complex interstate systems. While direct military control was limited in some regions, tribute arrangements formalized Assyria's position as a hegemonic power, with subordinate kings maintaining local autonomy under Assyrian oversight. Inscriptions note both the submission of rulers and their obligation to provide soldiers, supplies, and symbolic offerings. This system allowed Assyria to expand influence while mitigating the costs of continuous occupation, establishing patterns of indirect governance that would persist in later imperial strategies. The reign also highlights the strategic use of urban centers as administrative and military hubs. Excavations at Tel Barsip reveal evidence of fortified citadels, warehouses, and officials' residences, reflecting an organized Assyrian presence that integrated military, administrative, and economic functions. Such centers facilitated tribute collection, troop mobilization, and monitoring of local populations. The ability to institutionalize authority through urban infrastructure was a key factor in sustaining Assyrian dominance in regions distant from the core Tigris heartland. Shalmaneser III's campaigns were accompanied by ideological reinforcement. Inscriptions frequently invoke the god Ashur, portraying the king as divinely sanctioned to subdue enemies and establish order. Reliefs and stelae depict tribute processions, captives, and conquered cities, linking military success with religious legitimacy. This visual and textual program reinforced the perception of Assyrian authority among both subject populations and neighboring states. The combination of ideological messaging, tribute integration, and administrative control created a multifaceted model for projecting imperial power beyond the core territories. The cumulative effect of Shalmaneser III's westward projection was both expansionary and consolidatory. While the coalition at Karkar and other local resistance demonstrated the limits of rapid conquest, successive campaigns gradually integrated key trade corridors, fortified critical cities, and established administrative mechanisms capable of sustaining long-term control. The balance of coercion, tribute extraction, and provincial incorporation exemplifies the Neo-Assyrian strategy of territorial management. Expansion was accompanied by structures to maintain authority and absorb conquered populations into the imperial system. By the end of Shalmaneser III's reign, Assyria had established a durable framework for Western dominance. Although continuous resistance from Aramean, Israelite, and Phoenician polities required ongoing military engagement, the combination of administrative centers, garrison fortifications, and tributary obligations allowed Assyria to project influence efficiently. The integration of military, economic, and ideological tools during this period laid the groundwork for subsequent rulers, who would consolidate these territories and expand further into the Levant and beyond. Archaeological evidence supports this assessment. Excavations at Western sites show continuity of occupation under Assyrian oversight, with administrative tablets, fortifications, and construction projects reflecting organized control. The alignment of material culture with textual evidence from stelae and monoliths confirms the practical application of imperial policies described in royal inscriptions. The integration of conquered regions into the Assyrian economic and political system demonstrates the systematic approach Shalmaneser III employed, balancing coercive measures with mechanisms for long-term governance. Shalmaneser III's reign thus represents a maturation of Neo-Assyrian imperial strategy. Military campaigns, tributary networks, administrative organization, and ideological messaging were coordinated to project authority over diverse populations. The operational lessons from Western campaigns informed subsequent rulers, enabling more efficient resource allocation, frontier management, and integration of distant territories. This period of sustained westward expansion set a precedent for the territorial ambitions and bureaucratic sophistication that would define the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. After a period of internal challenges and long-term frontier management, Assyria was prepared to consolidate its gains under a transformative king, setting the stage for further centralization, large-scale conquest, and the fully institutionalized imperial model that would characterize the apex of Assyrian power. Assyria's power rested on a provincial system capable of managing millions across diverse regions. The Neo-Assyrian Empire's territorial expansion was matched by the development of an unprecedentedly sophisticated provincial administration. Central to this system were governors, known as Saknu, appointed directly by the king to oversee the management of provinces, cities, and key agricultural districts. These officials were responsible for enforcing taxation, organizing conscription, supervising legal disputes, and overseeing the collection and storage of surplus resources. Tablets recovered from Kalhu, Nineveh, and provincial archives provide extensive evidence for the mechanisms of control, illustrating how authority extended from the palace to the rural hinterlands. Governors operated within a hierarchical structure that combined local knowledge with central oversight. Each province was subdivided into smaller districts, overseen by subordinate officials, who reported on agricultural yields, population counts, and security concerns. Census records, often inscribed on clay tablets, documented inhabitants' obligations to the crown, including labor service, military conscription, and tribute payments. These documents highlight the empire's capacity to monitor its population with precision, providing data essential for taxation, resource allocation, and military mobilization. By maintaining detailed demographic and economic information, the Assyrian state could anticipate shortages, plan campaigns, and prevent unrest in culturally and geographically diverse regions. The taxation framework integrated multiple sources of revenue. Provinces contributed in kind, providing grain, livestock, textiles, and raw materials, which were stored in state-controlled granaries and redistributed to supply armies, construction projects, and palace estates. Monetary tribute in the form of silver or other metals also supplemented in-kind contributions. Tablets indicate that tribute obligations were meticulously recorded and periodically reviewed by provincial officials, ensuring accountability. This system allowed the state to sustain large-scale infrastructure projects and military campaigns, providing the material foundation for Assyrian imperial power. Legal enforcement within provinces reinforced central authority. Governors acted as intermediaries between the crown and local populations, administering justice based on a combination of imperial edicts and regional law codes. Legal tablets recovered from provincial archives describe cases involving property disputes, labor obligations, and military conscription, demonstrating the practical application of royal authority at the local level. Judicial oversight ensured compliance with taxation and conscription requirements, while also providing mechanisms for resolving disputes in ways that preserved social order and reinforced the legitimacy of Assyrian governance. Communication between the provinces and the central palace was critical for effective administration. Official correspondence, often in cuneiform, transmitted reports on economic production, military preparedness, and civil disputes. Couriers and relay stations facilitated rapid information flow across vast distances, enabling the king and his advisors to make informed decisions about resource allocation, troop movements, and political interventions. Archaeological evidence, including tablet archives at Kalhu and Nineveh, demonstrates that this system was not merely bureaucratic in theory but actively used to govern regions as distant as the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia. The integration of culturally diverse regions was a key feature of Neo-Assyrian provincial administration. Conquered peoples, including Arameans, Phoenicians, Israelites, and Hurrians, were incorporated into the imperial system through a combination of tribute obligations, local governance, and resettlement programs. Deportations were strategically implemented to redistribute populations, mitigate rebellion, and supply labor for agriculture, urban construction, and infrastructure projects. Archaeological evidence shows that relocated communities were often settled in fortified towns or administrative centers, where they contributed to local economies while remaining under the supervision of provincial governors. This approach facilitated political control while promoting economic integration across ethnically and linguistically diverse territories. Administrative centers functioned as nodes of economic, military, and bureaucratic activity. Provincial capitals contained granaries, barracks, palaces, and workshops, supporting both the local population and Assyrian officials. Excavations at Tel-Barsip, Arslan Tash, and other western sites reveal planned urban layouts with fortified citadels and storage facilities, demonstrating the standardized implementation of provincial infrastructure. These centers allowed governors to coordinate military campaigns, enforce tribute collection, and supervise agricultural production efficiently, reinforcing the interdependence of administrative, economic, and military structures within the empire. Provincial administration also facilitated social control and ideological integration. The presence of Assyrian officials, inscriptions, and monumental architecture reinforced the authority of the king and the ideological claim that the empire's expansion was divinely sanctioned by the god Ashur. Officials ensured that local rulers acknowledged Assyrian supremacy, conducted required rituals, and participated in imperial ceremonies, strengthening both loyalty and cultural cohesion. By embedding state authority within administrative, religious, and economic structures, the empire maintained cohesion across vast and heterogeneous regions. The provincial system was dynamic, allowing adaptation to local conditions while maintaining central oversight. Governors exercised discretion in responding to specific challenges, such as resource shortages, local unrest, or frontier security threats, but were accountable to the king through regular reports and audits. This balance of centralization and local flexibility enabled the Assyrian state to govern effectively over long distances, ensuring rapid responses to crises without undermining overall administrative coherence. The efficacy of the Neo-Assyrian provincial administration directly enabled large-scale economic expansion. By systematically organizing tribute, labor, and resources, the empire could sustain monumental construction projects, extensive road networks, and large standing armies. Provinces acted as both economic engines and logistical bases, ensuring that the state could project power, mobilize resources, and maintain authority across its expanding borders. This administrative model was central to Assyria's transformation from a territorial power into a cohesive empire capable of sustaining dominance over diverse populations for centuries. In summary, the Neo-Assyrian provincial system was a cornerstone of imperial governance. Through hierarchical administration, precise taxation, census management, legal oversight, and integration of diverse populations, the empire achieved a level of administrative sophistication unparalleled in the early first millennium BCE. Governors coordinated economic production, enforced tribute, and maintained security, while communication networks ensured central oversight and informed decision-making. By linking administrative, economic, military, and ideological strategies, the provincial system allowed the Neo-Assyrian Empire to manage millions across culturally and geographically diverse regions, laying the foundation for the empire's sustained expansion and long-term stability. Effective governance, as established in this section, created the necessary conditions for large-scale economic and infrastructural projects, which will be examined in the subsequent section. Agricultural intensification created the economic engine that sustained imperial expansion. The Neo-Assyrian Empire relied on a complex and highly organized economic system, centered on agricultural production, resource extraction, and the mobilization of labor. Administrative records, including grain accounts, livestock inventories, and tribute lists from Kalhu, Nineveh, and provincial archives, reveal a detailed picture of how the empire generated surplus to support both military campaigns and monumental construction projects. These sources demonstrate that economic management was systematic, integrated with provincial administration, and crucial to the sustainability of imperial power. Agriculture formed the backbone of the Assyrian economy. Irrigation networks, often reconstructed through archaeological surveys, enabled intensive cultivation along the Tigris, Upper Euphrates, and their tributaries. Canals, levees, and reservoirs facilitated the regulation of seasonal flooding, maximizing arable land and stabilizing crop yields. Records indicate standardized allocation of fields, crop rotation, and the use of state-controlled granaries to store surplus. Archaeological survey data show that settlements expanded during the Neo-Assyrian period, with previously marginal areas incorporated into productive agricultural zones. This intensification allowed the state to extract tribute while maintaining local subsistence, balancing imperial demands with population needs. In addition to staple crops, the Assyrian economy encompassed extensive livestock management. Administrative tablets record herds of cattle, sheep, and goats, maintained both for local consumption and as contributions to state projects. Livestock served multiple functions, providing food for urban and military populations, raw materials for textiles and leather goods, and tribute to the crown. State records also document specialized production, such as flax and wool, which supported textile industries crucial for clothing, trade, and military provisioning. These industries were often organized within provincial centers, with production coordinated under the supervision of governors and local officials. Labor mobilization was a key component of economic management. Population registers and administrative tablets reveal the use of both local inhabitants and deported populations for agricultural and construction work. Deportees, relocated from conquered territories, were assigned to state estates, urban construction projects, and temple maintenance, contributing to the redistribution of resources and the integration of diverse populations. Labor obligations were precisely recorded, ensuring that the state could efficiently coordinate agricultural production, public works, and infrastructure projects while maintaining social control. Trade networks complemented agricultural and craft production. Long-distance trade along the Euphrates and Tigris corridors linked Assyrian centers with Anatolia, the Levant, and the Iranian plateau. Textual evidence, such as merchant letters and administrative tablets, documents the exchange of metals, timber, textiles, and luxury goods. These exchanges not only provided material resources but also facilitated political alliances and reinforced Assyrian influence over subordinate and neighboring polities. Markets within provincial centers served as nodes of distribution, allowing tribute and surplus to circulate efficiently and sustain the imperial economy. The coordination of economic activity required meticulous administrative oversight. Provincial governors, supported by scribes and local officials, monitored crop yields, livestock inventories, and labor allocation. Reports transmitted to the central palace informed decisions regarding taxation, resource redistribution, and military provisioning. Archaeological evidence from provincial administrative complexes reveals standardized storage facilities, including granaries and livestock enclosures, demonstrating the integration of physical infrastructure with bureaucratic control. This system ensured that surplus could be rapidly mobilized to meet state needs, whether feeding troops on campaign or supplying materials for urban construction. Irrigation and agricultural intensification were often accompanied by technological and organizational innovations. Canals were periodically cleaned, levees reinforced, and reservoir capacity expanded to maintain consistent water supply. Field surveys indicate that settlement patterns shifted to optimize proximity to water resources, facilitating year-round cultivation and reducing vulnerability to drought. Combined with coordinated labor deployment, these measures maximized output and minimized the risk of localized shortages, contributing to the resilience of the Assyrian economic system. Tribute and taxation further augmented economic capacity. Conquered territories were required to supply grain, livestock, and specialized goods, which were recorded in provincial archives and channeled to central stores. These contributions supported palace and temple complexes, military operations, and public infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from Tel Barsip and Arslan Tash shows fortifications and administrative buildings associated with tribute collection, indicating the spatial organization of economic control. The systematic integration of tribute into the imperial economy reinforced both material capacity and political authority, ensuring that conquered regions contributed to the sustainability of the empire. The economic surplus generated through agriculture, trade, and labor mobilization directly enabled military and building projects. Standing armies, garrisoned along strategic frontiers, relied on stored grain, livestock, and supplies. Monumental architecture, including palaces, temples, and infrastructure, was funded by centralized resources drawn from provincial production and tribute. Administrative coordination ensured that labor, materials, and food were allocated efficiently, linking economic management to the operational and symbolic power of the state. The integration of agriculture, labor, and trade into a coherent economic network allowed Assyria to sustain large-scale operations and maintain stability across a diverse and geographically expansive territory. The systematic approach to economic management demonstrates the interdependence of administrative, military, and infrastructural systems. Agricultural intensification, labor deployment, trade networks, and tribute collection were coordinated under provincial governance to generate resources sufficient for imperial objectives. Archaeological and textual evidence collectively illustrate that the Assyrian economy was not merely extractive but structured to support sustainable expansion, central authority, and the projection of power over a heterogeneous population. By organizing agricultural production, trade, and labor into an integrated system, the Neo-Assyrian Empire created the material foundation for its military campaigns, provincial administration, and monumental building projects. Economic surplus facilitated both operational flexibility and long-term strategic planning, enabling the state to respond to environmental, demographic, and geopolitical challenges. The coordination of production, tribute, and labor underpinned Assyria's ability to sustain authority over millions of subjects, reinforcing the link between economic infrastructure and imperial durability. This systematic organization of the economy directly prepared the empire for the next phase of large-scale infrastructure development. Irrigation networks, storage facilities, roadways, and urban centers all depended upon the reliable extraction, distribution, and management of resources. The economic and labor systems described in this section thus formed the essential preconditions for the monumental architectural and logistical achievements of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which will be examined in the subsequent section. An empire of Assyria's scale required infrastructure that moved information as efficiently as armies. The Neo-Assyrian Empire's administrative and military success depended heavily on a sophisticated system of roads, relay stations, and logistical coordination. Stretching from the heartland along the Tigris to the Levant, Anatolia, and the Zagros frontier, these networks enabled the rapid transmission of information, the movement of troops, and the transport of resources essential for both governance and construction projects. Archaeological evidence from provincial centers, combined with royal inscriptions, demonstrates that the empire deliberately invested in infrastructure to maintain central control over vast and culturally diverse territories. Roads formed the backbone of the Assyrian communication and supply network. Survey archaeology and excavation of routes between Kalhu, Nineveh, Tul-Barsip, and other strategic settlements reveal that major thoroughfares were carefully constructed and maintained to facilitate year-round travel. These roads connected provincial capitals, administrative centers, and military outposts, allowing governors and military commanders to relay information, coordinate campaigns, and implement royal directives with remarkable speed. Maintenance of the road network was coordinated by provincial authorities, ensuring that key arteries remained passable despite seasonal flooding or environmental obstacles. Relay stations, strategically located along major routes, enabled messages and personnel to traverse long distances efficiently. Royal inscriptions indicate that couriers could transmit official orders, tax reports, and military intelligence from the Levant to the palace at Nimrud or Nineveh in remarkably short periods. These stations also functioned as logistical hubs, providing horses, provisions, and temporary lodging for officials and messengers. The combination of roads and relay stations created an integrated communication system, allowing the central authority to maintain oversight of far-flung provinces while responding to emerging threats and administrative needs. Administrative correspondence relied on this physical network to ensure centralized decision-making. Clay tablets, discovered at provincial archives, record detailed reports from governors concerning taxation, crop yields, labor allocation, and local security. The timely arrival of such reports allowed the king and his advisors to make informed policy decisions, deploy military forces, and adjust resource distribution. In effect, the road and relay network acted as a circulatory system for the empire, transmitting both information and authority across multiple layers of governance. Logistics for military operations were closely integrated with these communication networks. Armies were provisioned through coordinated planning that accounted for grain, water, livestock, and weaponry. Supply depots were established along campaign routes, often in fortified towns or administrative centers, ensuring continuous support during extended operations. Inscriptions from Shalmaneser III and subsequent rulers detail the organized movement of chariots, infantry, and siege equipment, illustrating the precision with which resources were marshaled for campaigns. Archaeological excavations confirm the existence of storage facilities, granaries, and staging areas aligned with major roads, emphasizing the practical integration of transportation and supply systems. The movement of construction materials for monumental projects also relied on this infrastructure. Timber from Lebanon, stone from northern quarries, and metals from Anatolia and Iran were transported along established routes, coordinated through provincial officials and relay networks. Royal inscriptions from the reigns of Ashur-Nisirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III describe the mobilization of labor and materials for palace construction, fortifications, and temple building. The road system, therefore, served not only military and administrative functions but also facilitated the logistical demands of state-sponsored construction on a monumental scale. The design of roads and relay stations reflected strategic priorities. Routes often linked natural geographic corridors, such as river valleys and plains, with fortified cities or administrative centers, optimizing both speed and security. Archaeological surveys demonstrate that many roads were deliberately aligned with rivers or elevated terrain to minimize disruption during seasonal flooding. This planning allowed armies, couriers, and merchant caravans to maintain consistent movement throughout the year, reducing vulnerability to environmental hazards and ensuring continuity of imperial control. Coordination between provincial authorities and central administrators was essential to maintain the efficiency of these networks. Governors were responsible for reporting on the condition of roads, relay stations, and storage depots, while provincial officials ensured that local labor was allocated to maintenance tasks. Tablets from Nineveh and Kalhu show records of labor assignments for road repairs, provisioning of relay stations, and transport of materials, illustrating the bureaucratic oversight required to sustain such a system. This combination of centralized planning and provincial execution created a resilient infrastructure capable of supporting both administrative and military objectives. The efficiency of Assyrian communication and logistics facilitated rapid responses to both internal disturbances and external threats. In frontier regions, the movement of troops and supplies allowed the state to project authority quickly, suppress rebellions, and reinforce garrisons. Similarly, administrative correspondence enabled the king to assess tribute collection, resource availability, and the performance of governors in real time. The integration of roads, relay stations, and provincial reporting thus enhanced both the operational and strategic flexibility of the empire. In addition to functional purposes, roads and logistical infrastructure contributed to the ideological projection of imperial power. Well-maintained routes and relay stations symbolized the reach and efficiency of the king's authority, reinforcing the perception of a centralized, capable state. Monuments, inscriptions, and way stations often commemorated military campaigns or administrative achievements, linking infrastructure to the broader narrative of Assyrian kingship as both divinely sanctioned and methodically executed. By the end of this phase of development, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had established a communication and logistical network capable of sustaining governance over millions of subjects across diverse terrains and distant provinces. The integration of roads, relay stations, supply depots, and provincial correspondence ensured that both armies and administrators could operate effectively, providing the operational foundation for continued expansion, military campaigns, and monumental construction projects. This extensive infrastructure directly enabled subsequent military and administrative initiatives. With the movement of information, personnel, and resources secured, the empire was positioned to conduct complex campaigns, reinforce provincial authority, and maintain economic stability across its territories. Roads and logistics thus formed the operational spine of the Neo-Assyrian state, linking governance, economy, and military power into a cohesive imperial system. Assyria built one of the most organized and technologically advanced armies of the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrian military represented a comprehensive integration of manpower, technology, and organizational sophistication. Central to its effectiveness was the coordination of infantry, chariotry, and later cavalry units, each with specialized roles within combined arms operations. Infantry formed the backbone of the army, equipped with spears, swords, shields, and bows, while chariots provided rapid mobility and shock capability during both offensive and defensive engagements. The introduction of cavalry, particularly in the late 9th and 8th centuries BCE, enhanced reconnaissance, raiding, and flanking operations, allowing commanders to respond flexibly to diverse battlefield conditions. Administrative tablets and payroll records indicate that units were organized according to hierarchical structures, with commanders overseeing tens, hundreds, or thousands of soldiers, ensuring clear lines of authority and accountability. Technological innovation was another pillar of Assyrian military strength. Iron weaponry gradually replaced bronze in infantry and chariot armaments, providing greater durability and lethality. Siege technologies, including battering rams, sappers' equipment, and mobile towers, were deployed systematically in the reduction of fortified cities. Reliefs from the Northwest Palace at Nineveh, commissioned by Ashur-Nisirpal II and Shalmaneser III, depict these innovations in action, illustrating the use of ladders, ramps, and protective mantlets to breach city walls. These images, corroborated by archaeological evidence from besieged sites, highlight the sophisticated engineering knowledge embedded within the army and the strategic emphasis on offensive capabilities. Recruitment and manpower management were crucial to sustaining continuous campaigns. The Assyrian army drew on conscription, voluntary enlistment, and the labor of deported populations to maintain troop strength. Cuneiform tablets detail quotas from provinces, specifying numbers of infantry, chariots, and support personnel required for campaigns. Provincial governors coordinated these contributions, ensuring that troops were raised efficiently while balancing local economic and demographic needs. In some cases, specialized units were trained for particular terrain or campaign objectives, reflecting an understanding of the operational environment and the need for unit versatility. Logistics and supply lines underpinned the operational effectiveness of the military. Detailed records indicate that campaigns were supported by prepositioned granaries, wagon trains, and depots along established road networks. Horses, draft animals, and pack animals were managed through state-controlled resources, enabling rapid movement of both troops and material. These logistical systems ensured that the army could operate for extended periods far from the Assyrian heartland, sustaining sieges, garrisons, and mobile operations across Syria, Babylonia, and Anatolia. Coordination between provincial officials and central administrators allowed commanders to requisition food, water, and equipment, integrating military operations into the broader imperial economic and administrative framework. Unit specialization was a hallmark of Neo-Assyrian military organization. Infantry divisions were often structured according to weapon type, including spear, bow, and sword contingents, while chariot units varied in composition from light, fast-moving teams to heavily armored shock units. Siege specialists were trained in the operation of battering rams, ladder deployment, and undermining city walls, often operating in concert with infantry and chariot support. Cavalry, initially auxiliary, gradually assumed a more prominent role in reconnaissance, flanking, and pursuit, demonstrating the empire's adaptability to changing tactical requirements. Reliefs and administrative documents indicate that units were rotated between active campaigns and garrison duties, maintaining readiness while reducing attrition and fatigue. Training and discipline were reinforced through administrative oversight. Royal inscriptions describe drills, formation exercises, and the implementation of standardized equipment and tactical manuals. Provincial officials monitored recruitment, provisioning, and adherence to operational protocols, ensuring uniformity across regions and campaigns. This system minimized inefficiencies, enhanced battlefield cohesion, and allowed the Assyrian army to conduct coordinated operations over multiple theaters simultaneously. The integration of technological, organizational, and human elements reflected a deliberate state strategy to maintain military superiority and project imperial authority. Strategic doctrine emphasized both offensive and defensive operations. Offensive campaigns often targeted regional polities and fortified cities to expand the empire, secure tribute, and suppress potential threats. Defensive measures included the fortification of provincial capitals, establishment of garrisons along strategic corridors, and rapid mobilization of relief forces. Reliefs and inscriptions depict siege engines, encampments, and fortified positions, providing a visual record of the operational environment. The combination of tactical flexibility, technological advantage, and logistical preparation allowed Assyrian commanders to execute prolonged campaigns with predictable outcomes, setting a precedent for systematic military planning in the ancient Near East. The integration of political, economic, and military structures was critical to the army's effectiveness. Provincial governors facilitated recruitment and provisioning, tribute and agricultural surplus finance campaigns, and infrastructure such as roads and depots ensured mobility and supply. Royal authority coordinated these components, with the king as the ultimate military commander. This systemic approach meant that the army was not merely a collection of units, but a cohesive instrument of state power, capable of sustained operations, territorial expansion, and enforcement of Assyrian policy across diverse regions. Evidence from campaign inscriptions confirms the operational and organizational sophistication of the military. Accounts of Ashur-Nirpal II's Western campaigns, Shalmaneser III's Levantine expeditions, and Tiglath-Pileser III's systematic conquests highlight detailed planning, resource management, and tactical execution. These records emphasize the combination of manpower, logistics, technology, and administrative oversight that characterized Neo-Assyrian warfare, demonstrating the deliberate design of military systems to achieve strategic objectives while minimizing operational risk. The army's composition, organization, and technological capability established the foundations for Assyria's imperial expansion. By integrating infantry, chariots, cavalry, siege engines, and specialized units within a coordinated logistical and administrative framework, the state created a durable and adaptable military apparatus. This system allowed the empire to conduct complex campaigns across vast territories, enforce central authority, and integrate newly conquered regions into a cohesive imperial structure. Ultimately, the Neo-Assyrian army exemplifies the interdependence of military, economic, and administrative systems. Recruitment, training, technology, logistics, and provincial coordination combine to create a force capable of sustained dominance. The operational lessons and organizational innovations of this period would inform subsequent campaigns and expansions, shaping the military culture and strategic doctrine of the empire for centuries. Assyrian warfare functioned as both a military and administrative instrument. The Neo-Assyrian Empire's military campaigns operated within a predictable, cyclical structure designed to maintain territorial control, extract resources, and enforce compliance among vassals. Textual evidence from royal inscriptions, administrative tablets, and annals of kings such as Tukulti-Ninurta II, 890 to 884 BCE, and Ashur-Nisirpal II, 883 to 859 BCE, demonstrates that campaigns were typically seasonal, coordinated with agricultural cycles, and integrated with administrative objectives. By aligning military activity with resource availability and logistical capacity, the Assyrian state maximized operational efficiency while minimizing disruption to domestic production. Campaigns were often divided into distinct phases: initial reconnaissance and reconnaissance raids, followed by full-scale military expeditions, occupation of contested territories, and finally, administrative consolidation. Reconnaissance and raiding allowed commanders to gather intelligence on enemy positions, evaluate terrain, and test the readiness of frontier populations. Punitive expeditions, designed to suppress rebellion or enforce tribute obligations, were executed with speed and precision. Inscriptions detail the systematic destruction of fortified settlements, seizure of livestock, and deportation of resistant populations, illustrating the dual military and administrative objectives of these operations. Full-scale expeditions were meticulously planned and logistically supported. Administrative records indicate that provincial governors were responsible for supplying soldiers, food, transport animals, and equipment, while central authorities coordinated the movement of siege engines, chariots, and cavalry. Seasonal timing was critical. Campaigns were typically launched after the harvest to ensure sufficient supplies and avoid overstretching both human and material resources. Reliefs from Kalhu and Nineveh depict these operations, showing organized columns of infantry, chariots, and supply convoys, reflecting the systematic nature of Assyrian military planning. Occupation and consolidation phases were closely linked to governance. Newly conquered territories were not merely subdued militarily. They were integrated into the imperial system through the installation of compliant local rulers, the imposition of tribute, and the establishment of administrative infrastructure. Provincial capitals were fortified, garrisons deployed, and logistical support established to maintain Assyrian presence. Inscriptions from Ashur-Nisirpal II describe the rebuilding of cities, construction of fortifications, and imposition of Assyrian law, demonstrating that military action served as an instrument of state authority rather than an end in itself. Resource extraction was a central objective of campaign cycles. Tribute in the form of grain, livestock, metals, and luxury goods was collected systematically from vassal states, either directly through taxation or indirectly through military oversight. Administrative tablets indicate that provinces contributed both in kind and through labor obligations, which sustained the army, funded construction projects, and reinforced economic centralization. This dual function, combining military conquest with economic integration, allowed the empire to sustain prolonged operations without destabilizing its internal economy. The use of deportations and population relocations exemplifies the administrative dimension of warfare. Resistant populations were frequently relocated to prevent future uprisings, redistribute labor, and supply provincial projects. Archaeological surveys and textual records indicate that deportees were resettled in strategic locations, often contributing to agriculture, military garrisons, and urban development. These practices reinforced Assyrian authority, integrated diverse populations into the imperial system, and maintained the economic and social stability necessary for sustained expansion. Assyrian military campaigns also served as deterrents. Inscriptions frequently emphasized the destruction of cities, the subjugation of rebellious rulers, and the imposition of severe punishments. Such accounts communicated both to local populations and neighboring states the consequences of defiance. By linking military action to the enforcement of law, tribute, and political compliance, the Assyrian kings leveraged warfare as a proactive instrument of control rather than a purely reactive response to conflict. Strategic use of intelligence and reconnaissance reinforced the efficiency of campaign cycles. Scouts and informants provided data on terrain, enemy dispositions, and potential supply sources, enabling commanders to plan routes, anticipate resistance, and coordinate the timing of sieges and battles. Records from Tukulti-Ninurta II emphasize systematic evaluation of border regions, demonstrating that operational planning incorporated geographic, demographic, and economic considerations. This integration of intelligence into campaign planning exemplifies the deliberate and calculated nature of Assyrian military strategy. Coordination between military and administrative hierarchies was essential. Provincial governors and local officials facilitated conscription, supplied resources, and monitored compliance with campaign directives. Tablets from provincial archives document the mobilization of soldiers, collection of supplies, and reporting of campaign outcomes to central authorities. This bureaucratic integration ensured that campaigns were not ad hoc or isolated. Rather, they were carefully orchestrated extensions of imperial policy, linking military force directly to governance objectives. The cyclical pattern of military campaigns reinforced long-term imperial stability. Seasonal expeditions allowed the empire to respond to rebellions promptly, secure tribute, and maintain frontier security. Repeated campaigns also facilitated the systematic incorporation of newly conquered territories, ensuring that expansion translated into lasting administrative and economic control. By alternating periods of active military engagement with phases of consolidation, the Assyrian state sustained its authority over diverse and distant regions without overextending its resources or destabilizing internal production. In conclusion, the Neo-Assyrian campaign system exemplified the integration of military, administrative, and economic strategies. Warfare functioned as a multifaceted instrument, enforcing political authority, extracting resources, and ensuring compliance across the empire. Seasonal expeditions, punitive raids, and systematic consolidation allowed the Assyrian state to maintain control over vast territories while minimizing internal disruption. This approach set the precedent for the aggressive imperial policies of later kings, whose campaigns would expand Assyria to its greatest territorial extent. By establishing a structured, cyclical approach to military operations, the Neo-Assyrians demonstrated how warfare could simultaneously serve strategic, economic, and administrative functions. The mechanisms of control detailed in this section provide the foundation for understanding the empire's subsequent peak under Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, and Sargon II, when these systems were deployed at an unprecedented scale across the Near East. Mass relocation was not merely punitive, it was a calculated tool of imperial restructuring. The Neo-Assyrian Empire employed systematic deportation policies as an instrument of governance, economic management, and political control. Administrative records, including census lists, provincial archives, and palace correspondence, demonstrate that deportations were organized, documented, and implemented to achieve strategic objectives rather than as arbitrary acts of violence. Archaeological surveys of resettled communities, combined with textual evidence from Assyrian royal inscriptions, indicate that these population movements transformed the demographic, economic, and cultural landscape of the empire. The rationale behind deportations was multifaceted. Politically, the relocation of rebellious or potentially disloyal populations mitigated threats to central authority. By removing groups from their native territories, Assyrian rulers reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance and prevented the re-establishment of local power bases. Inscriptions from Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II describe the capture and resettlement of entire communities following military campaigns, emphasizing the strategic intent to neutralize potential opposition while extending imperial influence into newly conquered regions. Economically, deportation served to redistribute labor to areas of the empire where it was most needed. Administrative tablets reveal that relocated populations were assigned to agricultural estates, textile workshops, urban construction projects, and provincial infrastructure. This system allowed the state to address labor shortages in frontier zones, increase agricultural output, and support the construction of palaces, temples, and fortifications. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites in northern Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Zagros region demonstrates the presence of communities exhibiting Assyrian material culture, confirming that deportees contributed to local economic integration. Census records and provincial archives illustrate the systematic nature of these population movements. Lists of families, occupations, and possessions were compiled prior to relocation, enabling administrators to allocate labor efficiently and monitor the integration of new populations. These records also facilitated taxation, military conscription, and provisioning, ensuring that deportees became functional components of the imperial system rather than unmanaged populations. In effect, relocation policies reinforced both economic productivity and administrative oversight simultaneously. The scale of deportation varied according to strategic priorities. Large-scale relocations were often conducted following major campaigns against resistant states or rebellious provinces. For example, Sargon II's campaigns in Samaria, Babylonia, and Ur-II resulted in the resettlement of tens of thousands of individuals. Smaller, targeted movements were implemented to populate frontier towns, garrison settlements, or newly conquered regions requiring skilled labor. Archaeological surveys show the emergence of new villages and fortified settlements along critical trade and communication routes, reflecting deliberate planning in population placement to secure strategic objectives. Deportation policies also facilitated cultural and administrative integration. Relocated populations were often settled alongside Assyrian administrators or loyal local elites, promoting the adoption of Assyrian law, language, and practices. Inscriptions and administrative texts indicate that Assyrian officials supervised local governance, tax collection, and religious observance, embedding the relocated communities within the imperial framework. This process enhanced the coherence of the empire, ensuring that demographic redistribution contributed not only to economic productivity but also to political stability. Evidence from archaeological and textual sources confirms that deportations were closely coordinated with military campaigns. Logistics were meticulously planned. Lists of supplies, transport animals, and security personnel ensured that relocations could be executed without excessive disruption. Administrative correspondence frequently specifies the routes, timing, and destination of deported populations, indicating a bureaucratic infrastructure capable of managing large-scale movements over significant distances. Roads, depots, and fortified settlements, discussed in previous sections, were integral to this logistical coordination. The effects of these policies were far-reaching. Demographically, Assyrian relocation transformed provincial populations, diluting local concentrations of power and redistributing skilled labor across the empire. Economically, the integration of deported populations contributed to agricultural intensification, urban development, and artisanal production. Politically, these policies reinforced imperial authority by embedding loyal or neutralized populations within strategic regions, reducing the likelihood of insurrection and facilitating the administration of diverse territories. Settlement patterns observed in archaeological excavations confirm that relocated populations adopted Assyrian architectural forms, pottery styles, and administrative practices, indicating both adaptation and integration into the imperial system. Interpretively, deportation illustrates the calculated nature of Assyrian statecraft. It was not purely punitive or coercive. Rather, it was an instrument to redistribute human capital, secure loyalty, and extend administrative control. This systemic approach demonstrates the interdependence of military action, economic planning, and governance. By coordinating campaigns with relocation strategies, the Assyrian state maximized the utility of conquest, transforming defeated populations into functional components of the imperial system while simultaneously neutralizing political threats. Inscriptions from rulers such as Sargon II, Tiglath-Pileser III, and Esarhaddon provide additional insight into the ideological framing of deportations. Kings presented these actions as divinely sanctioned, emphasizing the role of Ashur in guiding their campaigns and ensuring justice. This ideological dimension reinforced the legitimacy of relocation policies, presenting them not only as pragmatic administrative tools, but also as measures consistent with religious and political norms. Monumental inscriptions frequently detailed the numbers of deported families, the cities conquered, and the resources extracted, underscoring the organized and systematic nature of these measures. The cumulative effect of these integration strategies was to create a more resilient, administratively coherent, and economically productive empire. By redistributing populations, Assyrian rulers ensured that frontier regions were stabilized, resource flows maintained, and potential rebellions mitigated. Deportations complemented other mechanisms of control, including military garrisons, provincial administration, and infrastructure development, forming a multifaceted system that reinforced both the reach and durability of imperial power. By the end of this phase, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had established a replicable method for incorporating conquered populations into the state. Deportations were integral to territorial consolidation, economic production, and social control, preparing the empire for the reigns of its most powerful kings, who would exploit these mechanisms to expand the empire to its greatest territorial extent. The deliberate, bureaucratically managed nature of these relocations illustrates how the Assyrians combined military conquest with administrative and demographic engineering, creating a durable template for imperial governance that extended well beyond the battlefield. Tiglath-Pileser III created the administrative and military model for the empire's greatest century. Tiglath-Pileser III, 744 to 727 BCE, is widely recognized as the architect of the Neo-Assyrian Empire's most enduring administrative and military systems. Upon ascending the throne, he inherited a state recovering from internal instability, regional rebellions, and fragmented provincial authority. Contemporary royal inscriptions and administrative tablets indicate that he immediately undertook a comprehensive reorganization of the empire, establishing new provinces, restructuring local governance, and consolidating fiscal control. This systematic approach allowed for direct Assyrian rule over formerly semi-autonomous regions and standardized tribute collection, providing both economic stability and a reliable flow of resources to support sustained military campaigns. The provincial reforms implemented by Tiglath-Pileser III represented a fundamental shift in imperial administration. Previously, many conquered territories had been governed indirectly through vassal rulers or local elites, whose loyalty was often tenuous. By converting these regions into fully integrated provinces, Paniate, each governed by a centrally appointed official, typically a provincial governor, Saknu, Tiglath-Pileser centralized authority and reduced the risk of rebellion. Administrative correspondence from Nineveh and Kalhu indicates that these governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining garrisons, and overseeing local legal matters, ensuring consistent enforcement of Assyrian law and policies. These measures extended the reach of the central administration into the daily life of provincial populations, reinforcing both political and fiscal control. The standardization of taxation and tribute under Tiglath-Pileser III was critical to maintaining the empire's economic base. Royal inscriptions and cuneiform records describe systematic extraction of agricultural produce, livestock, precious metals, and other resources from newly annexed regions. Provinces were assessed according to predetermined quotas, which allowed for predictable inflows of supplies to the central treasury and provisioning of military forces. Archaeological survey data from Upper Mesopotamia, the Levant, and northern Babylonia corroborate these practices, demonstrating the presence of storage facilities, fortified administrative centers, and logistical infrastructure capable of supporting both civilian administration and sustained military operations. Military reform was equally central to Tiglath-Pileser III's transformation of Assyria. Administrative tablets and inscriptions detail the expansion of professional units, particularly cavalry, which complemented the traditional infantry and chariot corps. This allowed for greater operational flexibility and mobility, particularly during campaigns in Syria, Philistia, and Babylonia. Evidence indicates that soldiers were recruited, trained, and provisioned year-round, with permanent garrisons in key frontier locations, ensuring rapid deployment when necessary. By combining centralized command, professionalized units, and enhanced mobility, Tiglath-Pileser created a military apparatus capable of both offensive expansion and defensive consolidation. Campaigns during his reign illustrate the effectiveness of these reforms. In the west, Tiglath-Pileser subdued rebellious Aramean polities and incorporated key territories in Syria and the Levant directly into the imperial structure. Inscriptions describe the capture of fortified cities, the deportation of resistant populations, and the installation of loyal governors, reflecting the integration of military and administrative strategies. In Babylonia, he conducted successive campaigns to suppress local dynasts and secure tributary compliance, extending Assyrian authority over southern Mesopotamia. These operations were supported by the logistical networks established under his reforms, demonstrating how administrative restructuring and military organization operated in concert. The professionalization of the army under Tiglath-Pileser III also involved detailed attention to recruitment, training, and unit specialization. Infantry units were organized according to weapon type and tactical function, while cavalry provided reconnaissance, rapid strike capability, and flanking support. Siege specialists accompanied campaigns against fortified cities, employing battering rams, siege towers, and coordinated assault techniques. Administrative records document the rotation of troops between active campaigns and garrison duties, maintaining readiness while reducing attrition and fatigue. These measures ensured that military operations were both systematic and sustainable, allowing Assyria to conduct campaigns over multiple theaters simultaneously. Tiglath-Pileser's reforms extended beyond military and administrative domains into infrastructure and communication systems. Royal inscriptions emphasized the maintenance of roads, relay stations, and supply depots that connected provincial centers to the imperial heartland. These networks facilitated rapid troop movement, enabled timely collection of tribute, and supported the transfer of administrative information across vast distances. Archaeological evidence from strategic provincial sites confirms the construction of fortified administrative centers, storage facilities, and way stations, illustrating the integration of infrastructure into both governance and military strategy. Another key element of Tiglath-Pileser III's system was the deliberate use of deportation and population relocation as a tool of imperial control. Textual records detail the transfer of rebellious populations from the Levant, northern Syria, and Babylonia to Assyrian heartlands or other provinces requiring labor. These measures neutralized political threats, redistributed labor to strategic regions, and reinforced Assyrian presence in newly integrated territories. Archaeological data from resettled communities shows the adoption of Assyrian material culture, confirming the role of deportees in consolidating administrative, economic, and cultural control. Royal inscriptions further reveal the ideological framing of Tiglath-Pileser III's rule. The king is portrayed as the executor of Assur's will, combining military prowess, administrative wisdom, and divine sanction to justify reforms and conquests. Monumental reliefs and palace inscriptions reinforce his authority, emphasizing both the efficacy of his policies and the integration of conquered territories into a centralized, hierarchical state. This ideological component legitimized structural changes, ensuring that administrative and military innovations were reinforced by a narrative of divinely mandated kingship. Interpretively, Tiglath-Pileser III's reign demonstrates the interdependence of administrative reform, military innovation, and economic management in the consolidation of imperial power. By centralizing provincial governance, standardizing tribute and taxation, professionalizing the military and integrating deportation into territorial control, he created a template for effective imperial administration. This model allowed subsequent rulers to expand the empire rapidly while maintaining control over diverse populations and distant regions. By the end of his reign, Assyria was transformed from a fragmented northern kingdom into a cohesive, centralized empire capable of sustained military operations, efficient administration, and economic extraction. The structural foundations laid by Tiglath-Pileser III provided the basis for the remarkable expansions of Sargon II, 722 to 705 BCE, and Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BCE, whose campaigns would extend Assyrian authority to its maximum territorial extent. The integration of administrative, military, and economic reforms under his rule exemplifies the deliberate, systemic approach to imperial governance that characterized the Neo-Assyrian Empire at its peak. In conclusion, Tiglath-Pileser III's innovations established enduring patterns of provincial administration, military organization, and economic control. His campaigns illustrate the practical application of these reforms, while inscriptions and archaeological evidence document the structural consolidation of empire. These foundations allowed his successors to build on an established administrative military framework, ensuring the durability, coherence, and effectiveness of Assyrian imperial power throughout the 8th and early 7th centuries BCE. Sargon II combined military force with ideological architecture to project imperial authority. Sargon II, 722 to 705 BCE, inherited the Neo-Assyrian throne following a period of dynastic instability. His reign was marked by decisive military campaigns, administrative consolidation, and the strategic construction of monumental architecture, which together reinforced Assyria's position as the dominant power in the Near East. Primary sources, including palace reliefs, foundation inscriptions, royal correspondence, and administrative archives, provide detailed evidence of Sargon's systematic approach to imperial governance and military expansion. One of the most notable achievements of Sargon II was the final conquest of Samaria in 722 BCE, which marked the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. Biblical accounts, corroborated by Assyrian inscriptions such as the Ras Sam cylinder, describe the deportation of tens of thousands of Israelites and their resettlement in various parts of the empire. This operation illustrates both the military and administrative dimensions of Sargon's policies. The campaign neutralized a rebellious vassal, secured tribute, and integrated the population into the imperial labor system. Archaeological evidence, including settlement shifts and material culture in resettlement areas, supports the scale and organization of these population movements. Sargon's campaigns against Urartu in the Armenian highlands demonstrate his strategic approach to border security and resource control. Inscriptions detail repeated offensives that subdued fortified cities, seized agricultural and mineral resources, and established Assyrian garrisons along the northern frontier. Administrative tablets from provincial centers in eastern Anatolia reveal the assignment of military governors, Saknu, and the establishment of supply depots, illustrating how military success was immediately converted into long-term territorial administration. By combining conquest with structured provincial integration, Sargon ensured that military victories produced enduring control rather than temporary occupation. The construction of Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad, exemplifies the intersection of ideology, administration, and urban planning in Sargon II's reign. Foundation inscriptions, excavation reports, and palace reliefs indicate that the city was designed as a model administrative center and symbolic capital, projecting royal authority across the empire. The city's walls, gates, palaces, and temples were aligned with Assyrian religious and political ideals, serving both practical and symbolic functions. Administrative tablets recovered from Dur-Sharrukin document bureaucratic operations, including taxation, legal adjudication, and labor management, demonstrating that the city functioned as both an ideological statement and a working administrative hub. Sargon's architectural program extended beyond the capital. Reconstruction and fortification projects in provincial centers reinforced Assyrian control, and facilitated communication and logistical support for military and economic operations. Reliefs depict fortified cities, bridges, and roads, reflecting the integration of infrastructure into both governance and defense. By situating monumental projects in strategic locations, Sargon projected imperial power visually while simultaneously enhancing administrative efficiency. Military organization during Sargon II's reign continued the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III, with professionalized infantry, expanded cavalry units, and siege specialists capable of subduing both urban and rural resistance. Inscriptions detail campaigns in Babylonia, the Levant, and against nomadic or semi-nomadic groups in the Zagros and Armenian highlands. These campaigns combined tactical innovation with logistical planning, ensuring rapid movement, secure supply lines, and the systematic imposition of tribute and governance. Administrative archives indicate the rotation of troops, provisioning of garrisons, and coordination between central authorities and provincial governors, demonstrating the operational integration of military and civil administration. Sargon II's use of ideology was closely tied to his military and administrative initiatives. Inscriptions frequently present his actions as divinely sanctioned by Ashur, framing conquest, deportation, and construction as expressions of religious and cosmic order. This ideological framework legitimized his authority, justified the incorporation of distant territories, and reinforced the loyalty of provincial administrators and military officials. Reliefs depicting battles, sieges, and deportations served as visual propaganda, conveying the power and legitimacy of the king to both internal and external audiences. Deportation and resettlement policies under Sargon II were closely coordinated with military operations. Populations from conquered regions were relocated to stabilize sensitive frontier zones, provide labor for construction projects, and integrate diverse communities into the imperial economy. Archaeological evidence from northern Mesopotamia and the Levant confirms the presence of displaced populations adopting Assyrian material culture, indicating both functional and cultural integration. Census tablets and provincial records show the organized allocation of labor and resources, reinforcing the administrative sophistication of these policies. Sargon's consolidation efforts extended to legal and bureaucratic systems. Administrative tablets from Dur-Sharrukin and provincial centers illustrate the enforcement of standardized taxation, record-keeping, and legal adjudication, ensuring uniform governance across the empire. These measures were essential in stabilizing newly conquered territories and maintaining Assyrian authority over culturally and geographically diverse populations. By linking military success with administrative integration, Sargon created a durable model of imperial control that extended beyond immediate conquest. The cumulative impact of Sargon II's policies was a strengthened, more centralized, and territorially secure empire. By combining decisive military action with administrative innovation, population management, and ideological projection, he transformed Assyria into a state capable of sustained expansion and effective governance. The fall of Samaria, the subjugation of Urartu, and the construction of Dur-Sharrukin exemplify the interconnectedness of military, administrative, and ideological strategies during his reign. Sargon's death in 705 BCE created a moment of transition. While his policies established a robust framework for provincial administration, military deployment, and ideological projection, successors faced the challenge of maintaining control over extensive territories with diverse populations. Textual and archaeological evidence suggests that these challenges prompted adjustments under Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BCE, who would continue the integration of military, administrative, and ideological mechanisms while addressing regional instability and frontier pressures. In conclusion, Sargon II's reign demonstrates the deliberate coordination of military conquest, administrative consolidation, and ideological expression. His campaigns neutralized external threats, integrated conquered populations, and extended the reach of central authority, while his architectural projects reinforced both symbolic and functional aspects of imperial power. By consolidating the territorial and administrative gains of his predecessors and extending them through systemic innovations, Sargon II created a model of governance that allowed the Neo-Assyrian Empire to operate at an unprecedented scale, preparing the stage for the subsequent reign of Sennacherib and the continued expansion of Assyrian dominion. Sennacherib reshaped both the empire's political landscape and its capital city. Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BCE, ascended to the Assyrian throne following the death of his father, Sargon II, inheriting an empire that was extensive, militarily disciplined, and administratively centralized. His reign is particularly notable for major military campaigns, decisive actions in Babylonia and Judah, and extensive urban and hydraulic projects in Nineveh, which transformed the city into a preeminent political and administrative center. Contemporary inscriptions, royal reliefs, and archaeological evidence from Kuyunjik provide detailed insight into his systematic approach to governance, warfare, and urban planning. One of the defining features of Sennacherib's rule was his engagement with Babylonia, a region that had historically resisted Assyrian domination. Babylonian chronicles, administrative tablets, and Sennacherib's own inscriptions document multiple campaigns aimed at suppressing rebellions, reasserting imperial control, and neutralizing local dynasts. The culmination of these efforts was the sack and systematic destruction of Babylon in 689 BCE. Archaeological surveys of the site, alongside textual evidence, confirm the removal of city walls, palaces, and temples, illustrating a punitive policy designed to eliminate opposition and demonstrate the supremacy of Assyrian authority. These actions reinforced the centralization of power and underscored the consequences of defiance, consolidating Sennacherib's control over southern Mesopotamia. In addition to punitive campaigns, Sennacherib maintained military activity in the Levant, particularly in Judah. The Lachish reliefs excavated at the site of Lachish provide a detailed visual record of his siege of the city in 701 BCE, revealing organized military logistics, siege engines, and systematic deportation of captives. These depictions, combined with textual sources from Assyrian archives, illustrate the integration of military strategy, administrative oversight, and population management. The operations in Judah reflect Sennacherib's broader approach to frontier governance. Military precision, enforcement of tribute, and the establishment of Assyrian authority over semi-independent states. Sennacherib's campaigns were closely linked to his administrative policies. Inscriptions describe the reassignment of governors, the imposition of standardized tribute, and the incorporation of formerly autonomous territories into the provincial system. Administrative tablets from Nineveh document the collection of taxes, organization of labor, and deployment of military units in coordination with provincial governors. This integration of military, administrative, and fiscal structures ensured that campaigns reinforced, rather than disrupted, the imperial framework, allowing for sustainable control over distant regions. Perhaps the most visible aspect of Sennacherib's reign is his transformation of Nineveh. Excavations at Kuyunjik reveal that he expanded the city's boundaries, constructed new palace complexes, administrative buildings, and temple precincts, and implemented large-scale hydraulic works to support urban populations and agriculture. Canals, aqueducts, and irrigation systems diverted water from the Tigris River, enhancing agricultural production within the city's hinterland and providing a reliable water supply for urban residents. These projects illustrate the strategic use of infrastructure to strengthen the political, economic, and symbolic centrality of the capital. The Southwest Palace, constructed under Sennacherib, demonstrates the combination of ideological projection and administrative functionality. Reliefs depict military campaigns, religious rituals, and royal audiences, serving as both propaganda and documentation of imperial authority. Administrative tablets discovered within the palace indicate active bureaucratic management, including tax collection, labor allocation, and correspondence with provincial officials. This integration of ceremonial, residential, and administrative spaces reflects a deliberate strategy to consolidate authority, centralize governance, and visually communicate the power of the king. Sennacherib's hydraulic projects were particularly innovative and extensive. Archaeological evidence shows canals that linked distant water sources to the city, reservoirs for irrigation, and the redirection of tributaries to facilitate crop cultivation. These projects not only increased food security for Nineveh's growing population but also supported the broader imperial economy, by enabling surplus production for taxation and provisioning armies. Administrative tablets confirm the use of organized labor for construction and maintenance, demonstrating the integration of infrastructure into both economic and political governance. The king's ideological approach reinforced these structural initiatives. Sennacherib presented himself as the chosen agent of Ashur, executing divine will through military conquest, urban transformation, and monumental construction. Royal inscriptions describe the destruction of rebellious cities, the establishment of new administrative centers, and the expansion of Nineveh as divinely sanctioned acts. Reliefs, architectural planning, and cuneiform texts collectively project a narrative of a king who combined military prowess, administrative innovation, and urban vision to reinforce the legitimacy and durability of imperial authority. Interpretively, Sennacherib's reign illustrates the interdependence of military, administrative, and infrastructural strategies in maintaining imperial control. Military campaigns established territorial authority and enforced compliance. Deportations and resettlement reinforced political stability and labor distribution, and urban and hydraulic projects enhanced economic productivity, administrative efficiency, and ideological projection. These mechanisms functioned synergistically, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of how different components of governance could reinforce one another to sustain a large, culturally diverse empire. The demographic impact of Sennacherib's policies was significant. Deportations from Babylonia, Judah, and other contested regions redistributed populations to stabilize strategic areas, supply labor for infrastructure, and integrate local populations into the administrative and economic systems of the empire. Archaeological evidence, including shifts in settlement patterns and the adoption of Assyrian material culture, confirms the long-term impact of these relocations on the social and cultural fabric of the empire. By strategically relocating populations, Sennacherib strengthened central authority while mitigating potential rebellion. Sennacherib's military, administrative, and infrastructural initiatives collectively reinforced Nineveh's position as the heart of the empire. The integration of urban planning, hydraulic engineering, palace construction, and provincial coordination exemplifies the Assyrian model of governance, wherein the capital functioned as both symbolic center and operational hub. This transformation not only enhanced the efficiency and resilience of the state, but also served to visually communicate the power, sophistication, and reach of Assyrian rule to internal and external audiences alike. By the end of Sennacherib's reign in 681 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had reached a high point in terms of administrative centralization, military organization, and urban infrastructure. Although his death marked the beginning of new political challenges, his reforms and construction projects left a durable imprint on Nineveh and the empire as a whole. The combination of military success, administrative rigor, population management, and urban transformation exemplifies the complex, systemic strategies that allowed the Neo-Assyrian Empire to maintain dominance over a vast and diverse territory. In conclusion, Sennacherib's reign represents a pivotal period in Assyrian history, characterized by military assertiveness, the systematic destruction and resettlement of rebellious regions, and large-scale urban and hydraulic projects. His reconstruction of Nineveh, together with campaigns in Babylonia and Judah, demonstrates the integration of ideological, administrative, and military policies into a coherent imperial strategy. These measures solidified the Assyrian state, set the stage for subsequent cultural and scholarly achievements, and underscored the capacity of the empire to project authority through both material and administrative means. Esarhaddon extended Assyria's reach to the Nile while restoring internal equilibrium. Esarhaddon, 681 to 669 BCE, inherited a Neo-Assyrian empire that, despite its territorial extent and military prowess, faced the ongoing challenges of political stability, succession disputes, and integration of diverse populations. His reign is particularly notable for the combination of military conquest, domestic consolidation, and administrative refinement. Primary sources, including royal inscriptions, annals, administrative tablets, and contemporary correspondence, along with archaeological evidence from both Assyrian and Egyptian sites, provide detailed documentation of his policies and achievements. One of Esarhaddon's most significant accomplishments was the conquest of Egypt in 671 BCE, an event that expanded the empire's reach beyond Mesopotamia and the Levant. Royal inscriptions describe the crossing of the Sinai and the capture of key Egyptian cities, including Memphis, where Esarhaddon imposed tribute and secured Assyrian authority. These campaigns relied on highly organized military logistics, professionalized troops, and coordination between multiple theaters of operation. Administrative tablets from Assyrian provincial centers indicate the mobilization of resources, provisioning of troops, and communication with provincial governors, highlighting the operational sophistication required for such a trans-regional campaign. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian sites, including inscriptions and material culture reflecting Assyrian occupation, corroborates the textual records and demonstrates the tangible presence of Assyrian authority in conquered regions. The conquest of Egypt also illustrates the interplay between military action and diplomacy. Esarhaddon sought to establish loyalty among local elites through tribute agreements, the appointment of compliant governors, and the integration of Egyptian administrative structures into the Assyrian system. Letters preserved in the Assyrian archives detail negotiations with vassal rulers and arrangements for the payment of tribute, reflecting a strategic approach that combined coercion with administrative incorporation. This dual strategy ensured the projection of Assyrian power while minimizing the risk of prolonged insurgency in a distant territory. Simultaneously, Esarhaddon focused on internal stabilization, particularly the reconstruction and management of Babylon. Following Sennacherib's destruction of the city in 689 BCE, Babylon had remained a focal point of political and religious tension. Inscriptions document Esarhaddon's extensive rebuilding projects, including the reconstruction of temples, palaces, and city walls, as well as the reinstatement of Babylonian religious rituals. These actions served both practical and ideological purposes. They secured loyalty among Babylonian elites, reinforced the king's legitimacy as divinely sanctioned ruler, and restored economic and administrative functions critical to provincial integration. Archaeological surveys in Babylon reveal traces of construction consistent with Esarhaddon's inscriptions, demonstrating the material impact of his policies. Administrative stabilization under Esarhaddon extended across the empire. Tablets from Nineveh and provincial centers document reforms in taxation, land management, and legal adjudication, reflecting a systematic approach to governance. Provincial governors were closely monitored, census data were updated, and tribute assessments were standardized, ensuring consistent fiscal inflows. These measures reinforced central authority, facilitated resource mobilization for military and construction projects, and maintained control over culturally diverse populations, including Arameans, Babylonians, and Levantine communities. Esarhaddon's succession planning was another critical aspect of his reign. Recognizing the potential for dynastic instability, he established a clear line of succession for his son Ashurbanipal and coordinated administrative continuity to ensure the smooth transition of power. Royal inscriptions emphasize his concern for legitimate succession and the appointment of loyal officials to key positions. This attention to dynastic planning minimized internal disruption and provided the foundation for the cultural and intellectual flourishing that characterized Ashurbanipal's later reign. From a military perspective, Esarhaddon maintained and refined the professionalized Assyrian army established by his predecessors. Infantry, cavalry, chariots, and specialized siege units were deployed in coordinated campaigns, supported by the empire's logistical networks of roads, relay stations, and supply depots. Evidence from administrative tablets illustrates the systematic provisioning of troops, rotation of units between garrisons and active campaigns, and integration of conquered populations into labor systems that supported both military and infrastructural needs. These practices ensured operational efficiency and enabled the projection of power over long distances, particularly in the Egyptian theater. Interpretively, Esarhaddon's reign demonstrates the interdependence of military expansion, administrative consolidation, and ideological legitimacy. The conquest of Egypt was facilitated by pre-existing provincial structures, while the stabilization of Babylon reinforced central authority and economic management. His projects combined practical administration, military logistics, and ideological messaging to reinforce the perception of Assyrian power, both internally and externally. This integrated approach allowed the empire to maintain control over an unprecedented geographic and cultural range while minimizing the risk of fragmentation. Archaeological evidence further supports the textual accounts of Esarhaddon's policies. Excavations at Nineveh and Dur-Sharrukin reveal administrative tablets, urban planning initiatives, and monumental inscriptions that correspond with the king's recorded campaigns and building projects. In Egypt, inscriptions and material culture confirm Assyrian military presence and interactions with local administrative structures. These findings collectively demonstrate the empire's operational coherence and the tangible effects of Esarhaddon's policies across multiple regions. Esarhaddon also invested in religious and cultural legitimacy to support his authority. Restoration of temples in Babylon and sponsorship of cultic activities in Assyrian centers reinforced the divine sanction of his rule, linking military and administrative achievements to religious ideology. Temple rebuilding projects not only stabilized local elites, but also served as focal points for integrating populations into the imperial system, illustrating the role of religious infrastructure in sustaining political cohesion. The cumulative effect of Esarhaddon's reign was a fully stabilized, territorially extensive, and administratively coherent empire. His policies ensured that the Neo-Assyrian state was capable of sustained military operations, efficient governance, and strategic integration of diverse populations. By combining conquest, reconstruction, diplomacy, and succession planning, Esarhaddon extended the empire's reach while reinforcing its internal equilibrium, creating the conditions for the cultural and intellectual achievements of his son Ashurbanipal. In conclusion, Esarhaddon's reign exemplifies the strategic coordination of military, administrative, and ideological policies in maintaining and expanding imperial power. His conquest of Egypt extended Assyria's influence into North Africa, while his rebuilding of Babylon and administrative stabilization reinforced control over the empire's southern regions. Diplomatic engagement, succession planning, and infrastructural projects ensured continuity and durability of imperial authority. Collectively, these initiatives positioned the empire to enter a period of cultural, scholarly, and artistic prominence under Ashurbanipal, demonstrating the sophisticated integration of territorial expansion, internal consolidation, and ideological projection characteristic of the Neo-Assyrian state. Ashurbanipal ruled an empire whose intellectual legacy would outlast its political power. Ashurbanipal, 668 to 627 BCE, the son of Esarhaddon, presided over the Neo-Assyrian Empire during a period often regarded as its cultural and scholarly apogee. While military campaigns continued, his reign is distinguished by systematic patronage of learning, the compilation of extensive cuneiform archives, and the consolidation of administrative practices that enabled both governance and intellectual production. Primary sources, including royal inscriptions, administrative tablets, and archaeological evidence from Nineveh, document a regime that combined political authority with the deliberate cultivation of scholarship. A defining feature of Ashurbanipal's rule was the creation of his renowned library at Nineveh. Excavations at Kuyunjik uncovered thousands of clay tablets, encompassing administrative records, divination texts, medical treatises, legal codes, and literary compositions. Among these are the most complete surviving tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, along with other mythological and historiographical works. The systematic collection, copying, and organization of these texts indicate a sophisticated approach to knowledge management and archival preservation. Administrative tablets within the library illustrate that literary activity was closely linked to governance, with scribes trained in standardized cuneiform serving both bureaucratic and scholarly functions. The library reflects not only Ashurbanipal's personal scholarly interests but also the broader imperial ideology. Many inscriptions portray the king as a literate ruler, proficient in divine omens and the cuneiform script, capable of understanding and interpreting omens and historical precedents. This projection of intellectual authority reinforced his legitimacy, presenting the king as both warrior and scholar. Tablets documenting correspondence, provincial reports, and ritual texts demonstrate how literacy and learning were integrated into the administrative framework, enhancing both efficiency and centralized control. In addition to intellectual pursuits, Ashurbanipal continued active military campaigns, particularly in Elam, Arabia, and the southern Mesopotamian region. Reliefs from the North Palace at Nineveh depict detailed scenes of battle, siege, and the subjugation of enemies, illustrating the continued importance of military power in imperial governance. Campaigns in Elam were both punitive and strategic, neutralizing a persistent threat and securing Assyria's eastern borders. Administrative and royal texts detail the mobilization of troops, coordination with provincial governors, and systematic deportations, demonstrating the integration of military operations with the empire's administrative machinery. The intersection of culture and administration is evident in the scribal and scholarly traditions promoted under Ashurbanipal. Provincial governors, temple officials, and palace scribes contributed to the compilation and transmission of texts. Tablets indicate the standardization of orthography, training protocols for scribes, and the copying of key literary and legal works. This structured approach ensured both the preservation of knowledge and the dissemination of cultural norms throughout the empire. Archaeological evidence suggests that libraries and archives were established in provincial centers as well, extending the intellectual infrastructure beyond the capital. Ashurbanipal's patronage extended to religious and ritual texts, reflecting the continued integration of ideology, governance, and scholarship. Divination manuals, omens, and temple protocols were collected and maintained to guide decision-making in political, military, and ceremonial contexts. This integration reinforced the king's authority, linking the administration of the empire with perceived divine will. The library, therefore, functioned not merely as a repository of culture but as an operational resource for governance, supporting decision-making and ensuring the consistency of imperial ideology. Interpretively, Ashurbanipal's reign demonstrates how intellectual achievement was inseparable from the mechanisms of imperial administration. Literacy and scholarship were tools of statecraft. They enabled record-keeping, reinforced ideological authority, and facilitated coordination across provinces. By cultivating a professionalized scribal class and centralizing textual knowledge, Ashurbanipal enhanced both bureaucratic efficiency and the cultural prestige of the empire. This dual focus strengthened internal cohesion, particularly during periods of military activity and provincial unrest. The library's literary corpus provides critical insight into Mesopotamian culture, history, and religion. Texts collected from across the empire were preserved, translated, and standardized, creating an intellectual legacy that has outlasted the political structures of Assyria itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh tablets, historical chronicles, and legal compendia offer scholars a comprehensive view of Assyrian ideology, administration, and worldview, demonstrating the enduring value of Ashurbanipal's cultural investments. These works highlight the empire's role not only as a military power but also as a center of intellectual production. Archaeological evidence from Nineveh further underscores the material support for scholarly activity. Excavations revealed dedicated library rooms, storage areas for tablets, and organized shelving systems, indicating advanced methods of cataloging and preservation. Administrative tablets record the labor assignments, materials, and protocols associated with tablet production and copying, showing that scholarship was embedded in the empire's economic and bureaucratic structures. Such integration ensured that intellectual endeavors were systematically sustained and aligned with state priorities. Despite cultural achievements, Ashurbanipal's reign also illustrates the limits of intellectual and administrative sophistication in mitigating structural pressures. Inscriptions and administrative records indicate ongoing military challenges, rebellious vassals, and pressures from nomadic and semi-nomadic groups along the peripheries. While the empire's infrastructure, bureaucracy, and scholarly institutions were robust, these external and internal pressures foreshadowed difficulties that would intensify after his death. The cuneiform archives themselves reflect the monitoring of unrest, military campaigns, and provincial management, revealing an empire attentive to both knowledge preservation and political control. From a strategic perspective, Ashurbanipal's campaigns were closely coordinated with administrative and logistical networks. Provincial governors reported troop movements, requisitioned supplies, and recorded tribute collections, demonstrating the integration of military action with governance. Reliefs and inscriptions depict detailed planning, the use of intelligence gathered by scribes, and coordination across multiple regions. These mechanisms reflect the operational sophistication of the empire at its peak, combining military, bureaucratic, and intellectual resources to sustain control over a vast territory. In conclusion, Ashurbanipal's reign represents the cultural and scholarly high point of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His establishment of the Nineveh Library, promotion of scribal education, and compilation of literary, administrative, and religious texts exemplify the integration of intellectual and administrative power. Military campaigns, particularly in Elam and Arabia, demonstrate the continued reliance on organized force, while archival practices highlight the operational role of literacy in governance. By combining cultural patronage, administrative oversight, and strategic military action, Ashurbanipal presided over an empire whose intellectual legacy, preserved in cuneiform tablets, would survive long after its political structures had vanished. The achievements of Ashurbanipal underscore the Neo-Assyrian model of governance, a synthesis of military power, bureaucratic efficiency, and cultural production. Despite looming structural pressures, the empire at this stage exemplified the capacity of a complex state to coordinate military, administrative, and intellectual resources across a vast and diverse territory, creating a legacy whose scholarly and cultural significance continues to inform our understanding of the ancient Near East. Behind Assyria's cultural strength lay accumulating structural weaknesses. By the late 7th century BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, despite its remarkable military, administrative, and cultural achievements, faced mounting internal pressures that would eventually destabilize its territorial and political integrity. The reigns of Ashurbanipal and his immediate successors illustrate a period of overextension, demographic stress, and increasingly autonomous provincial authorities. Textual evidence from Nineveh, Babylon, and other provincial centers, comprising administrative tablets, royal inscriptions, and correspondence, provides insight into these systemic strains, documenting the interplay between governance demands, military commitments, and socio-political tensions. One of the most significant challenges was the sheer scale of the empire. At its height, the Neo-Assyrian state encompassed diverse populations across Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, and Egypt. Maintaining effective control over such a wide area required constant military deployments, administrative oversight, and fiscal extraction. Tablets from provincial archives reveal the heavy burden placed on governors, saknu, and military officials, who were responsible for taxation, troop levies, and enforcement of Assyrian law. Reports of delayed tributes, insufficient supplies, and mismanagement of local resources indicate that the central bureaucracy was increasingly stretched, leading to administrative fatigue. Rising provincial autonomy further complicated imperial governance. Long-serving governors and local elites began exercising greater de facto independence, sometimes challenging royal directives. Evidence from Babylonian correspondence and reports of rebellions highlight tensions between the central authority and provincial actors, particularly in regions with historical traditions of self-rule. These dynamics created a cycle in which the empire needed to allocate military resources to enforce loyalty, which in turn strained administrative and fiscal systems, reducing overall efficiency and increasing vulnerability to both internal and external threats. Demographic pressures also contributed to structural strain. The empire's policy of deportation and population relocation, while effective in consolidating control and mobilizing labor, placed significant demands on local economies and administrative systems. Census records and settlement archaeology demonstrate that resettled populations were often concentrated in frontier or strategically important areas, requiring supervision, provisioning, and integration into local agricultural and labor networks. Over time, these measures became logistically challenging, particularly in regions with recurring conflict or resource scarcity, compounding the operational burden on provincial and central authorities. Succession disputes and dynastic instability further weakened the imperial structure. While Ashurbanipal had established a clear line of succession, The later years of his reign and the early period of his successors were marked by contested claims and political intrigue. Royal inscriptions from this period emphasized loyalty oaths and administrative oversight intended to mitigate factionalism. Yet letters and reports suggest that local elites and military commanders sometimes aligned with rival claimants. Such disputes disrupted administrative continuity and diverted attention and resources from long-term governance and border security. Overextension of military commitments exacerbated these structural vulnerabilities. Campaigns in Egypt, the Levant, and Elam had previously required extensive coordination and resource mobilization, and in the late imperial period, maintaining similar operational capacity proved increasingly taxing. Administrative tablets from Nineveh document repeated requisitions for grain, livestock, and manpower, while reliefs and inscriptions indicate ongoing military expeditions aimed at suppressing rebellions or enforcing tribute. Sustained military pressure on multiple fronts not only drained economic resources but also strained the capacity of the provincial administration to sustain infrastructure and legal order. Economic pressures intersected with administrative and military challenges. Tributes from vassal states were a primary source of revenue, and delayed or reduced payments, recorded in correspondence and administrative tablets, contributed to fiscal stress. Inflationary pressures, localized crop failures, and the costs of urban maintenance and temple patronage further strained the imperial treasury. These factors forced the central administration to rely increasingly on local elites for resource collection and labor management, which in turn enhanced provincial autonomy and reduced the centralization that had previously characterized Neo-Assyrian governance. Archaeological evidence corroborates textual indications of strain. Excavations at Nineveh, Babylon, and provincial centers reveal signs of hurried construction, repairs to defensive walls, and the expansion of administrative facilities in ways that suggest reactive, rather than proactive, governance. Material culture demonstrates continuity of ritual and royal practice, but also indicates resource allocation challenges, such as incomplete fortifications and uneven maintenance of canals and roads, which were critical for economic and military operations. Cultural vibrancy persisted despite these pressures. Ashurbanipal's libraries, temple patronage, and monumental reliefs continued to flourish, demonstrating that intellectual and ideological institutions remained robust even as structural weaknesses accumulated. However, the contrast between the empire's cultural achievements and its administrative and military overextension underscores the limits of ideological projection in sustaining an extensive territorial state. Literacy, scholarship, and ceremonial display could not fully compensate for systemic logistical and political challenges. The convergence of these factors, administrative fatigue, overextension, succession disputes, demographic pressures, and rising provincial autonomy, created a precarious balance. While the empire remained formidable in military, economic, and cultural terms, these internal strains eroded resilience, leaving it vulnerable to coordinated external attacks and internal revolt. Inscriptions from the final decades of the empire show repeated attempts to reinforce provincial oversight, deploy loyal military units, and monitor potential rebellions, reflecting awareness of structural fragility. Yet, these measures were increasingly reactive rather than preventive. From a historiographical perspective, this period illustrates a broader principle of imperial dynamics. The maintenance of extensive multi-ethnic empires depends on the continuous alignment of military, administrative, economic, and demographic systems. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had achieved remarkable integration and operational efficiency under kings such as Ashurbanipal, yet structural vulnerabilities were inherent in the scale and complexity of the state. Textual and archaeological evidence shows that even the most sophisticated administrative apparatus cannot indefinitely offset the cumulative effects of overextension and local autonomy. In conclusion, the late Neo-Assyrian period demonstrates that beneath the empire's cultural and scholarly achievements lay a network of structural weaknesses. Demographic pressures, provincial autonomy, overextended military commitments, and succession disputes collectively stressed the administrative apparatus. Evidence from administrative tablets, royal inscriptions, and archaeological remains in Nineveh, Babylon, and peripheral provinces reveals an empire that was still powerful but increasingly reactive, attempting to sustain control through military action, bureaucratic oversight, and ideological reinforcement. These accumulated pressures set the stage for the rapid political and military collapse that would follow in the late 7th century BCE, underscoring the fragility of even the most sophisticated ancient imperial systems. By the end of this period, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had achieved unparalleled cultural, military, and administrative sophistication, yet internal structural strain rendered it vulnerable. The empire's final decades illustrate the tension between operational capability and systemic sustainability, providing insight into the mechanisms of imperial endurance and decline. This understanding of late Neo-Assyrian dynamics offers a framework for analyzing how complex states, despite apparent strength, can be undermined by cumulative internal pressures, a lesson evident in the empire's imminent collapse. Civil conflict drained Assyria's capacity to manage external threats. The period following Ashurbanipal's death in 627 BCE marked the beginning of the final phase of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, characterized by political fragmentation, contested succession, and escalating civil conflict. The absence of a universally recognized heir precipitated struggles among royal claimants and high-ranking officials, undermining centralized authority. Contemporary Babylonian chronicles, royal inscriptions, and administrative correspondence provide detailed insight into this period of instability, documenting both formal claims to the throne and localized acts of defiance. These sources reveal a state increasingly preoccupied with internal power struggles rather than external administration. Succession disputes were often intertwined with provincial power bases. Governors and military commanders controlled substantial resources and garrisons, and their support could determine the outcome of dynastic conflicts. Evidence from Nineveh and Kalhu administrative tablets indicates that certain provincial leaders withheld tribute, redirected military forces, or declared support for competing claimants. Such actions weakened the central bureaucracy, disrupted taxation systems, and reduced the capacity of the monarchy to enforce law uniformly. In some cases, reports suggest that provincial actors negotiated temporary autonomy in exchange for nominal allegiance, illustrating the erosion of imperial cohesion. Civil conflict was further compounded by the proliferation of regional revolts. Cities in Assyria's heartland, such as Arbela and Ashur, intermittently resisted royal authority or shifted their allegiance to rival claimants. Babylonian chronicles document multiple uprisings in southern Mesopotamia, where local rulers exploited the empire's internal divisions to assert greater independence. These revolts not only drained military resources but also disrupted trade, agricultural production, and the flow of tribute, magnifying fiscal strain and diminishing the state's operational capacity. Archaeological layers in affected cities reveal signs of fortification repair, destruction, and rebuilding, consistent with repeated episodes of conflict and instability. The internal fragmentation extended to elite institutions within the empire. Court officials, scribes, and temple authorities were caught between competing factions, resulting in administrative inefficiencies and conflicting reports. Letters from provincial archives indicate delays in the processing of legal documents, inconsistencies in taxation records, and mismanagement of labor and supplies. These administrative failures reflect the degree to which civil strife penetrated the empire's institutional framework, transforming previously standardized processes into reactive and inconsistent systems. Military forces, once the primary tool of Assyrian expansion and control, were increasingly diverted toward internal suppression rather than external defense. Records of troop movements demonstrate that regiments were deployed against rebellious cities and rival claimants, leaving frontier territories exposed. This redeployment weakened Assyria's deterrent capacity and emboldened external actors, who observed the empire's distracted state and prepared for opportunistic incursions. Reliefs and inscriptions from the period illustrate campaigns against internal adversaries, highlighting the sustained and costly use of military power to manage civil unrest. The historiographical record emphasizes the compounded effects of these succession crises. Babylonian chronicles, such as the Chronicle of Nabopolassar, present a narrative in which internal disunity directly enabled the emergence of external coalitions against Assyria. Royal inscriptions from late Neo-Assyrian kings acknowledge unrest and petition divine support, reflecting recognition of both the internal and cosmic dimensions of instability. These texts underscore the perception that civil conflict was not merely a political inconvenience but a systemic vulnerability threatening the empire's continuity. Analytically, the period illustrates the structural vulnerability of empires facing concentrated internal stress. The Neo-Assyrian system relied on centralized authority, professionalized bureaucracy, and coordinated military apparatus. When succession disputes disrupted the alignment of these elements, the mechanisms that had previously ensured cohesion became instruments of factional struggle. The empire's capacity to project power, administer justice, and maintain economic stability was severely compromised, demonstrating the interdependence of dynastic legitimacy, administrative order, and military discipline. In conclusion, the succession crises and civil conflict following Ashurbanipal's death critically weakened the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Infighting among royal claimants, combined with provincial revolts and administrative dysfunction, drained resources and attention from essential governance and defense. Textual and archaeological evidence illustrates how internal fragmentation undermined central authority, disrupted fiscal and military systems, and diminished the state's capacity to respond to external threats. These dynamics set the stage for the coordinated external pressures that would culminate in the fall of Nineveh and the dissolution of the Neo-Assyrian imperial structure. The erosion of central authority during this period highlights the fundamental principle that internal cohesion is a prerequisite for sustaining complex empires. By the late 620s BCE, Assyria's political and military systems, though sophisticated, were increasingly consumed by internal disputes, leaving the empire vulnerable to opportunistic neighbors and signaling the imminent collapse of one of the ancient world's most formidable powers. The combined force of rival states delivered the decisive blow to Assyria's capital. Following the prolonged internal fragmentation of the late Neo-Assyrian Empire, external actors seized the opportunity to challenge Assyrian supremacy. By the early 7th century BCE, a strategic alliance had formed between the Babylonians, led by Nabopolassar, and the Medes under King Cyaxares. Textual sources, including Babylonian chronicles and later classical accounts, indicate that this coalition was motivated by both territorial ambitions and the desire to end Assyrian domination over Mesopotamia and the Levant. The coordination of these rival powers marked a turning point in Near Eastern geopolitics, as previously fragmented external forces combined to confront the empire's weakened central authority. The Medo-Babylonian campaign followed a systematic strategy, targeting key Assyrian cities and fortifications to isolate the capital. Babylonian chronicles record the capture of Ashur, Haran, and other provincial centers, which had become semi-autonomous during the internal succession crises. Archaeological evidence from these sites shows signs of destruction, fortification breaches, and abandonment consistent with recorded military activity. These preliminary victories effectively disrupted Assyria's supply networks, severed communication lines, and eroded both military and administrative cohesion, leaving Nineveh increasingly isolated. The siege of Nineveh in 612 BCE represented the culmination of this coordinated effort. Contemporary sources, including the Babylonian Chronicle and fragments of later Greek historians, describe a multi-pronged assault involving both direct military engagement and strategic encirclement. Excavations at Kuyunjik, the site of ancient Nineveh, reveal extensive burned layers, collapsed walls, and destroyed palaces, corroborating textual accounts of widespread destruction. The archaeological record indicates that the city's fortifications, once among the most formidable in the Near East, were breached through sustained military pressure, possibly including battering rams, sapping techniques, and coordinated attacks on gates and towers. The fall of Nineveh was also facilitated by the weakening of the Assyrian military and administrative apparatus. Decades of civil conflict had left the garrison forces under strength and poorly coordinated, while provincial contributions of troops and provisions had diminished due to autonomy and defection. Inscriptions from the final Assyrian kings suggest repeated appeals for reinforcements and emergency conscriptions, but the empire's internal fragmentation prevented a coherent defensive strategy. As a result, the Medo-Babylonian coalition was able to exploit both structural and operational vulnerabilities. Strategically, the siege demonstrates the effectiveness of combined operations among multiple states against a previously dominant power. The Medes and Babylonians coordinated their campaigns to encircle the city, cut off supply routes, and systematically neutralize surrounding strongholds. The textual emphasis on coordinated leadership, troop movements, and the allocation of siege responsibilities highlights the sophistication of late Iron Age military planning. Archaeological evidence of concurrent destruction layers across multiple districts within Nineveh supports the conclusion that the assault was comprehensive, targeting both military installations and administrative centers. The destruction of Nineveh had immediate and profound consequences. Royal palaces, administrative archives, temples, and urban infrastructure were systematically destroyed, resulting in a collapse of bureaucratic continuity. Clay tablets from peripheral sites, while fragmentary, indicate that communication with the central government ceased, tribute flows were interrupted, and provincial governance disintegrated. This rapid administrative collapse confirms the critical role of the capital as both the symbolic and functional center of the Neo-Assyrian state. Interpretively, the siege illustrates the interaction between internal vulnerability and external opportunism. Assyria's prior internal fragmentation, civil war, succession disputes, and provincial autonomy created conditions that the Medo-Babylonian coalition could exploit. The conquest of Nineveh was not solely the result of superior military technology or tactics, but was facilitated by decades of cumulative structural weakness. Textual sources highlight this interplay, noting that external forces capitalized on the empire's inability to mobilize an effective, centralized defense. The fall of Nineveh also exemplifies the destruction of urban centers as a mechanism of imperial termination. Archaeological layers indicate widespread fire damage, collapsed walls, and destroyed administrative buildings, consistent with both military assault and deliberate devastation. These findings align with inscriptions describing the city as utterly destroyed and never to rise again, demonstrating the strategic and symbolic intent behind the coalition's actions. The annihilation of Nineveh not only ended the political life of the city, but also dismantled the centralized institutions that had sustained the empire for centuries. From a historiographical perspective, the siege underscores the vulnerability of complex empires to coordinated external action when internal cohesion is compromised. The Neo-Assyrian case illustrates that even highly militarized and administratively sophisticated states can fall rapidly when structural stress intersects with opportunistic alliances. The convergence of civil strife, provincial fragmentation, and external pressure provides a paradigm for understanding the mechanics of imperial collapse in the ancient world. In conclusion, the Medo-Babylonian alliance successfully executed a systematic campaign against Assyria, culminating in the decisive siege and destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE. Textual and archaeological evidence collectively demonstrate the coordination, planning, and execution of military operations, as well as the resulting collapse of political, administrative, and economic systems. The fall of the capital symbolized both the end of central authority and the culmination of long-term internal weaknesses, confirming the interplay between internal fragmentation and external opportunism in the final demise of one of the ancient Near East's most powerful empires. With Nineveh destroyed and administrative networks dismantled, the remnants of the Neo-Assyrian state attempted last-ditch resistance in peripheral cities, setting the stage for the final military actions that would terminate the empire entirely. The fall of Haran ended a state tradition more than a millennium old. Following the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE, remnants of the Neo-Assyrian military and administration regrouped at Haran, a strategically positioned city in northern Mesopotamia. Textual sources, including Babylonian chronicles and later classical accounts, record that Assyrian forces, under surviving members of the royal line, sought to maintain a foothold in the region and preserve the continuity of the monarchy. Archaeological surveys at Haran reveal evidence of reinforced fortifications and hurried construction, indicating preparation for an anticipated siege. Despite these efforts, the city ultimately fell in 609 BCE, marking the definitive end of Assyrian central authority. The choice of Haran as a final defensive center reflected both geographic and political considerations. Located near the upper Euphrates and close to trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia and the Levant, Haran offered access to resources and potential allies. Inscriptions from late Assyrian kings emphasize its symbolic significance as a center of worship for the god Sin, reinforcing the city's religious and ideological value. However, the reliance on Haran also exposed the limitations of a reduced Assyrian state. The remaining army was a fraction of its former strength, administrative cohesion was fragmented, and the city's hinterland could no longer reliably provide supplies or manpower. The Medo-Babylonian coalition, already victorious at Nineveh, pursued the retreating Assyrian forces systematically. Babylonian chronicles describe campaigns that surrounded Haran, cutting off reinforcements and isolating the city. Archaeological evidence indicates fire damage, collapsed walls, and destruction consistent with siege warfare. The fall of Haran resulted from both sustained military pressure and the inability of the surviving Assyrian administration to maintain operational coordination. Royal correspondence and administrative tablets from the period highlight attempts to organize defenses, requisition provisions, and call on allies, but these measures proved insufficient against the coalition's superior numbers and logistical advantage. The collapse at Haran marked the extinction of the Neo-Assyrian monarchy. Surviving royal claimants either perished during the siege or were captured, and no new centralized authority emerged to reconstitute the state. Babylonian and Median sources emphasize the finality of this event, noting the termination of Assyrian tribute, cessation of administrative record-keeping, and the dispersion of loyalist forces. The fall of Haran illustrates a broader principle in imperial studies. Without a secure capital or coherent administrative network, even militarily resilient states can disintegrate rapidly under coordinated external pressure. The demise of Assyrian urban centers during this final campaign had profound material and institutional consequences. Administrative archives, palace complexes, and temples were systematically destroyed or abandoned, severing the institutional memory that had underpinned Neo-Assyrian governance for over 3 centuries. Archaeological layers from Haran indicate simultaneous structural collapse and evidence of rapid abandonment, consistent with a military defeat that precluded organized withdrawal or reconstruction. The destruction of these centers eliminated the physical and bureaucratic infrastructure essential to state continuity. From a strategic perspective, the fall of Haran confirms the interplay between internal weakness and external opportunity. The empire's capacity to resist external conquest had been undermined by decades of civil conflict, succession disputes, and provincial fragmentation. The surviving Assyrian forces, though experienced and professional, could not compensate for the loss of central coordination, the depletion of resources, and the sustained pressure exerted by the Medo-Babylonian alliance. The campaign demonstrates how systemic vulnerability at the core of a state can magnify the effectiveness of an external coalition, even when the empire retains some operational military capability. Interpretively, Haran represents not only the end of political authority, but also a transitional moment for the region. Although the Neo-Assyrian state ceased to exist, Assyrian cultural, religious, and administrative practices persisted in successor polities and among displaced populations. Textual evidence indicates the continued veneration of Assyrian deities, the use of administrative terminology, and the retention of Assyrian scribal traditions in Babylonian, Median, and Levantine centers. This persistence underscores the difference between the cessation of centralized imperial control and the continuation of cultural influence. In conclusion, the fall of Haran in 609 BCE brought the Neo-Assyrian Empire to its definitive end. Archaeological evidence of destruction, textual accounts of military defeat, and the disappearance of centralized administrative authority collectively document the final collapse of a state that had dominated the Near East for over a millennium. The coordinated efforts of the Medo-Babylonian coalition exploited the empire's accumulated structural weaknesses, illustrating how internal fragmentation, combined with external pressure, precipitated the rapid termination of even the most sophisticated imperial systems. While political and military structures were extinguished, Assyria's cultural, religious, and intellectual legacies endured, influencing subsequent Mesopotamian and Near Eastern civilizations. The fall of Haran thus marks both a terminal point in Assyrian political history and a transition in the regional balance of power, providing a clear historical endpoint to the Neo-Assyrian imperial tradition. Assyria's administrative legacy became a foundation for later Near Eastern empires. Although the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed in 609 BCE with the fall of Haran, many of its administrative, military, and infrastructural innovations persisted in successor states. The Babylonians, who assumed control over much of southern Mesopotamia, incorporated Assyrian models of provincial governance, taxation, and record-keeping into their own administrative frameworks. Tablets from Babylonian archives indicate the continued use of Assyrian-style provincial divisions, officials with analogous titles, and standardized tribute procedures. These practices facilitated the integration of diverse populations and the efficient extraction of resources, demonstrating that Assyrian methods provided a template for post-imperial statecraft. Persian sources further illustrate the long-term influence of Assyrian administrative concepts. By the 6th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great adopted a network of provinces, satrapies, with governors accountable to the central authority, echoing Assyrian provincial structures. Scholars note that features such as standardized taxation, bureaucratic oversight, and communication networks, including relay stations along major roads, reflect conceptual continuity with Neo-Assyrian models. Although adapted to Persian imperial ideology, these mechanisms retained the functional goals pioneered by Assyria, maintaining order across a geographically and ethnically diverse realm, ensuring resource mobilization, and enabling rapid military and administrative response. The military practices of Assyria also influenced successor states. Babylonian, Median, and later Persian armies incorporated aspects of Assyrian organization, including standing troops, specialized units, and strategic deployment along critical frontiers. Assyrian methods of seasonal campaigning, siegecraft, and logistical coordination provided practical lessons for managing large, multi-ethnic forces. Surviving administrative tablets detailing troop levies and provisioning were consulted or adapted by post-Assyrian rulers, demonstrating a continuity in both record-keeping and strategic planning. This functional inheritance highlights how Assyria's approach to imperial military organization endured well beyond the political life of the empire itself. Assyrian cultural contributions persisted alongside administrative and military legacies. Temples, religious practices, and cultic traditions influenced Babylonian and later Persian religious systems. The continued veneration of deities such as Ashur and Nabu in certain regions, documented in both textual and archaeological records, indicates that religious institutions outlived the political structures that had supported them. In addition, scribal practices, literary forms, and archival organization developed under the Neo-Assyrian kings were preserved and transmitted through libraries, particularly in Nineveh, which remained an intellectual reference point for subsequent Near Eastern polities. The retention of cuneiform literacy, lexical lists, and historiographical methods underscores the enduring role of Assyria in shaping regional intellectual traditions. Evidence also demonstrates that Assyrian urban planning, infrastructure, and engineering provided models for successor states. Roads, canals, and fortifications originally constructed to support imperial control continued to function under Babylonian and later Persian administration. Archaeological surveys reveal the reuse and maintenance of Assyrian canal systems for irrigation, the adaptation of road networks for trade and military movement, and the reconstruction of fortified centers using existing Assyrian foundations. This continuity illustrates that even after political collapse, the material infrastructure of the empire sustained administrative efficiency and economic activity across Mesopotamia and adjacent regions. Interpretively, the transmission of Assyrian institutional practices demonstrates the duality of imperial legacy. Political authority may be ephemeral, but systemic innovations can persist and shape successive empires. Scholars emphasize that Assyria's capacity to integrate governance, military logistics, and communication into a cohesive system provided a durable template for managing large, multi-ethnic states. The survival of these practices in Babylonian, Median, and Persian contexts illustrates that imperial effectiveness is often judged not solely by territorial longevity, but by the functional endurance of administrative, military, and infrastructural mechanisms. Comparative studies reinforce the significance of Assyrian continuity. Later Near Eastern rulers explicitly emulated Assyrian forms of authority, often incorporating royal iconography, administrative titles, and legal norms into their own regimes. For example, Babylonian kings adopted standardized weight systems and tribute protocols reminiscent of those used in Assyria. Similarly, Persian inscriptions reference the logistical sophistication of earlier Mesopotamian states, implicitly acknowledging the functional advantages of structures pioneered by the Neo-Assyrian administration. These adaptations reflect both practical efficacy and a conscious recognition of Assyria's historical precedent. In conclusion, the collapse of the Neo-Assyrian state did not erase the empire's structural or cultural imprint. Administrative frameworks, military organization, religious institutions, and infrastructural systems continued to shape governance across Mesopotamia and beyond. The Babylonians, Medes, and later Persians inherited and adapted these practices, demonstrating the long-term utility and influence of Assyrian models. By examining the mechanisms of continuity, scholars gain insight into the ways in which a fallen empire can persist and function, informing the administrative and strategic practices of successive polities. These enduring structures complemented Assyria's broader cultural contributions, providing a foundation for the Near East's intellectual, bureaucratic, and strategic development. The empire's legacy illustrates the complex interaction between political collapse and institutional durability, highlighting that even after the termination of centralized authority, the innovations and practices of a once dominant state can shape the trajectory of regional history for centuries. The rediscovery of Assyria reintroduced a forgotten empire to modern scholarship. Although the Neo-Assyrian Empire had ceased to exist more than 2 millennia earlier, its material and textual legacy remained buried beneath alluvial deposits along the Tigris and its tributaries. The 19th century marked the beginning of systematic archaeological exploration that brought Assyria back into the global historical consciousness. Pioneering excavations by Austen Henry Layard at Nimrud, 1845 to 1851, revealed monumental palaces, extensive reliefs, and administrative archives. Layard's findings included the Northwest Palace of Ashur-Nisirpal II, decorated with bas-reliefs illustrating campaigns, religious rituals, and court life. These discoveries provided the first comprehensive visual and textual evidence of Assyria's imperial organization and military ideology, transforming scholarly perceptions of Mesopotamian statecraft. Simultaneously, Paul-Emile Botta's excavations at Khorsabad, 1843 to 1846, the site of Dur-Sharrukin, uncovered the palace of Sargon II. Botta's work revealed not only monumental architecture but also detailed reliefs depicting military campaigns, court ceremonies, and administrative scenes. The scale and sophistication of these constructions demonstrated the Neo-Assyrian capacity for urban planning and monumental expression, previously underestimated in both academic and popular narratives. Botta's contributions established a comparative framework for interpreting Assyrian art, architecture, and inscriptions alongside other Mesopotamian civilizations, emphasizing the empire's role as a central actor in Near Eastern history. The excavations also recovered large numbers of cuneiform tablets, including administrative, legal, and literary texts. Layard and subsequent explorers documented clay tablets that, when later deciphered, revealed Assyrian legal codes, correspondence with vassal rulers, and economic records. These texts illuminated the internal mechanisms of governance, the operation of provincial administration, and the coordination of military campaigns. The recovery of letters and decrees from kings such as Ashur-Nisirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III enabled historians to reconstruct both chronological sequences and patterns of diplomatic engagement across the Near East. In the 20th century, modern teams refined these early findings with systematic stratigraphic excavation, photographic documentation, and interdisciplinary methods. The University of Chicago Oriental Institute, for example, conducted extensive work at Nineveh and Nimrud, producing detailed site plans, epigraphic catalogs, and artifact analyses. These studies clarified the spatial organization of Assyrian capitals, palace complexes, temples, and city walls, providing insights into urban infrastructure, water management, and administrative logistics. Remote sensing and survey archaeology further mapped settlement patterns in the Assyrian heartland, corroborating textual accounts of provincial control, trade routes, and military installations. Archaeological rediscovery also advanced understanding of Assyrian cultural production. Bas-reliefs and monumental sculpture revealed conventions of royal propaganda, emphasizing the king's role as both military commander and religious intermediary. Art historians analyzed the symbolism, composition, and iconography of these works, demonstrating how visual media reinforced ideological hierarchies and imperial cohesion. Similarly, recovered libraries, including Ashurbanipal's extensive collection at Nineveh, provided an unparalleled record of Mesopotamian literature, historiography, and scholarship. Tablets containing the Epic of Gilgamesh, administrative texts, and lexical lists illustrated both continuity with earlier Mesopotamian traditions and Assyrian innovations in record-keeping and intellectual activity. The rediscovery of Assyria also reshaped broader understandings of Mesopotamian chronology and interregional interaction. Excavated inscriptions clarified the sequence of kings, military campaigns, and diplomatic exchanges with Egypt, Babylonia, and the Levant. Monumental architecture and urban layouts revealed the scale and organization of imperial governance, while correspondence and administrative tablets demonstrated the complexity of provincial management. Collectively, these findings challenged prior assumptions that regarded Assyria as a marginal or secondary state, instead establishing it as a preeminent power whose administrative and military systems influenced successive empires. Interpretively, the 19th and 20th century excavations underscore the importance of archaeological methodology in reconstructing lost civilizations. The careful recording of stratigraphy, epigraphic documentation, and comparative analysis with contemporary Near Eastern sites allowed scholars to situate Assyria within broader patterns of political, economic, and cultural development. The integration of material evidence with textual sources has produced a nuanced understanding of imperial expansion, provincial administration, and cultural expression, demonstrating the capacity of archaeology to recover systemic features of states long absent from the historical record. In conclusion, the archaeological rediscovery of Assyria, initiated by Layard, Bada, and later refined by modern teams, provided the empirical foundation for reconstructing one of the ancient Near East's most influential empires. Monumental palaces, bas-reliefs, administrative tablets, and libraries collectively illuminated Assyria's political, military, and intellectual achievements, while also challenging prior assumptions about the scale and sophistication of its society. These discoveries not only restored Assyria to historical prominence, but also established a methodological template for integrating archaeological, textual, and comparative analysis in the study of complex ancient states. Modern research continues to refine this understanding, employing new technologies, interdisciplinary approaches, and regional surveys to expand knowledge of Assyria's urban networks, economic systems, and cultural contributions. These ongoing efforts demonstrate that the legacy of Assyria is both a historical and scholarly construct, continually shaped by evidence, interpretation, and methodological innovation. Ongoing research continues to reshape scholarly interpretations of Assyria's power and complexity. Modern scholarship on the Neo-Assyrian Empire is characterized by ongoing debate over the nature of its governance, social structures, military organization, and economic systems. Historians and archaeologists continually reassess how centralized authority functioned across a multi-ethnic and geographically extensive territory. Recent studies emphasize the dynamic interplay between the royal court, provincial governors, and local elites. While earlier interpretations portrayed Assyrian rule as excessively brutal and purely coercive, contemporary research highlights a combination of administrative sophistication, bureaucratic standardization, and negotiated compliance with subordinate populations, offering a more nuanced understanding of imperial governance. Debates around Assyrian deportation policy remain central to historical inquiry. Inscriptions and administrative records document the relocation of populations for labor, resettlement, or political neutralization. Traditional narratives often interpret these policies as instruments of terror, yet recent analyses consider functional aspects of population transfer. Scholars note that deportations facilitated economic integration, repopulate underdeveloped regions, and reinforced military and agricultural infrastructure. Comparative demographic studies, supported by archaeological survey and settlement pattern analysis, allow researchers to quantify the scale of these movements and assess their long-term impact on regional cultural landscapes. Economic organization is another area of active debate. Assyrian administrative tablets, tribute records, and land surveys provide evidence of intensive agriculture, labor mobilization, and complex resource allocation. Historians question the degree to which surplus extraction was driven by royal centralization versus local initiative, and how trade networks connected Mesopotamian urban centers to Anatolia, the Levant, and the Zagros region. Digital modeling of settlement distribution, coupled with environmental and paleobotanical data, enables a better understanding of agricultural productivity, irrigation systems, and regional economic interdependence, offering a refined perspective on the empire's material foundations. Military structures and operational strategies also remain topics of scholarly discussion. Earlier interpretations emphasized the dominance of Assyrian iron weaponry and siegecraft, but recent research examines the integration of logistical planning, seasonal campaign cycles, and provincial levies. Archaeological evidence, including reliefs, fortifications, and weapon assemblages, combined with administrative records, indicates that military organization was intimately connected to governance and economic management. Scholars debate the extent to which permanent professional forces versus conscripted troops supported imperial objectives, and how military discipline and training influenced the effectiveness of campaigns across varied terrains. Advances in archaeological methodology have profoundly influenced these debates. Survey archaeology and remote sensing allow researchers to identify settlement hierarchies, road networks, and irrigation systems without intrusive excavation. Geographic information systems, GIS, facilitate spatial analysis of provincial administration, trade corridors, and military logistics. Digital reconstruction of palaces, temples, and urban layouts enables virtual modeling of Assyrian capitals and provincial centers, providing new insights into urban planning, resource allocation, and ceremonial spaces. These techniques allow for a more precise evaluation of the scale, complexity, and functional integration of the empire. Interpretive frameworks are also evolving in response to these data. Scholars increasingly situate Assyria within comparative imperial studies, examining how its administrative, military, and cultural practices relate to other ancient and pre-modern states. Questions of centralization, regional integration, and the balance between coercion and collaboration inform debates about imperial durability and collapse. The integration of textual, material, and environmental evidence enables a holistic perspective, demonstrating that Assyria's strength lay in its ability to coordinate political, economic, and military systems across diverse regions over sustained periods. In addition, historiographical analysis highlights the influence of 19th and 20th century interpretations on modern understanding. Early excavators emphasized monumental architecture and military conquest, which shaped perceptions of Assyria as a primarily aggressive and expansionist state. Contemporary scholarship, however, contextualizes these features within broader institutional and cultural systems, balancing evidence from reliefs and inscriptions with administrative documentation, demographic data, and comparative studies. This reassessment challenges simplistic narratives and underscores the methodological importance of integrating multiple types of evidence. In conclusion, current research on the Neo-Assyrian Empire illustrates the complexity and adaptability of historical interpretation. Ongoing debates over governance, deportation, economy, and military organization reveal the multifaceted nature of Assyrian imperial power. Archaeological innovations, digital technologies, and comparative frameworks continue to refine our understanding, demonstrating that Assyria's administration, infrastructure, and cultural production were deeply interconnected. These scholarly discussions maintain Assyria's relevance within broader studies of ancient empires, providing insights into how states manage complexity, mobilize resources, and sustain authority over extensive territories. By combining textual analysis, material evidence, and technological tools, modern historians construct a more comprehensive and nuanced picture of Assyria, one that moves beyond narratives of conquest to emphasize institutional resilience, economic integration, and cultural transmission. These investigations ensure that the Neo-Assyrian Empire remains a central subject in the study of ancient statecraft, empire building, and regional interaction in the Near East. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise, expansion, and legacy of the Assyrian Empire. If you found this exploration insightful, consider subscribing to our channel to continue uncovering the histories of civilizations that shaped the ancient world. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on new documentaries, and share your thoughts or questions in the comments. Your engagement helps us bring more rigorously researched history to life. For those who want to dive deeper, check the description for sources, further readings, and curated playlists on Mesopotamian and Near Eastern history.